The Saturday sun beat down on Main Street in Oak Ridge, Arizona, casting hard-edged shadows against storefronts that hadn't changed much since the Reagan era. Morgan Hayes felt the familiar weight of her canvas grocery bag against her hip as she stepped out of Donovan's Market. At 36, she moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd spent most of her adult life in uniform, 12 years as a Navy corpsman, attached to special operations teams, in places where mistakes meant body bags. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing a face weathered by desert sun and too many sleepless nights. The scar that ran along her jawline, a souvenir from an IED in Helmand Province, caught the light as she paused to check her phone. 3 years out of the service and civilian life still felt like an ill-fitting uniform. Main Street was alive with the weekend rhythm of small-town America. Families browsed shop windows, couples lounged at outdoor cafe tables, and the distant rumble of motorcycles provided a bass note to the afternoon symphony. Morgan registered these details automatically the way she'd been trained, scanning, cataloging, assessing. Old habits. The flash of light caught her eye first, a metallic glint between two parked cars that didn't belong. Her brain processed the anomaly before conscious thought caught up. In her peripheral vision, she spotted the target, a tall man in a leather vest standing outside the diner, coffee in hand, laughing with two companions. The patch on his back marked him clearly, Hell's Angels, the local chapter president, from the look of the rockers above and below the winged death's head. Morgan didn't know his name, had never spoken to him, but she recognized the stance a man accustomed to command to respect. The target wasn't moving, didn't see the danger. The figure in the shadows raised his arm. The weapon was already drawn. For a fraction of a second, time crystallized around Morgan. The world reduced to angles, distances, threat assessment, all those combat calculations her body knew better than her mind. 12 years of training made the decision before she could think it through. She moved. 3 long strides, boots striking pavement, with deliberate force. Her grocery bag hit the ground, oranges rolling across concrete. Her right hand slammed into the biker's chest, shoving him sideways with enough force to send him stumbling. "Gun!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the lazy afternoon chatter. The crack of the pistol split the air like thunder in a clear sky. The sound registered after the impact, a sledgehammer blow to her left shoulder that spun her half around. Heat bloomed outward from the point of impact, but Morgan kept her feet, her right hand already pressing against the wound, as warm blood seeped between her fingers. The street erupted in screams and motion, people scrambling for cover, the scrape of chairs against concrete as cafe patrons ducked beneath tables. Morgan's vision narrowed, focused on the shooter, male, medium height, black baseball cap, already retreating down the alley between the hardware store and the shuttered movie theater. "Stay down," she ordered the man she'd pushed, who was now staring at her from where he'd landed against the diner wall, his expression cycling through shock, confusion, and dawning comprehension. The 2 men with him were already moving, one sprinting toward the alley, the other stepping protectively in front of his leader while scanning for additional threats. Professional. Military training or something close to it. Morgan's tactical assessment continued despite the fire spreading through her shoulder. Single shooter, clean shot, subsonic round, likely 9mm, no follow-up shots. Not a professional hit, but not random either. Targeted. More motorcycles roared to life nearby, reinforcements arriving, or witnesses fleeing, she couldn't tell. The edges of her vision began to blur, adrenaline no longer fully masking the pain. Still she remained standing, pressure maintained on the wound, eyes still tracking movement on the street. The man she'd saved stepped forward, his weathered face set in lines of concern and something harder to read. He was older than she'd first registered, late 50s, with silver-streaked hair and a beard that couldn't hide the scar tissue around his left eye. His eyes were glacier blue, taking her measure with uncomfortable intensity. "You knew it was coming," he said. Not a question, but searching for understanding. Morgan's breath came in controlled measures, the way she'd trained herself during firefights. Saw the reflection? Barrel, sun. Economy of words as shock began to set in. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. The man's companion returned from the alley, shaking his head. "Gone, knew the back routes." The older biker never took his eyes off Morgan. "You're bleeding badly, ma'am." "Been worse," she replied, though the growing dampness down her side suggested otherwise. "Pressure, elevation, standard protocol." A strange expression crossed his face, recognition of the clipped, professional assessment. He'd heard language like that before in other circumstances. "I'm James Blackwood," he said, carefully removing his leather vest and pressing it against her wound with surprising gentleness. "And it appears I owe you my life." Morgan's lips twitched in what might have been a smile under different circumstances. Morgan Hayes, and let's call it professional courtesy. The last thing she registered before the paramedics arrived was the look in Blackwood's eyes, a mixture of gratitude, respect, and something that resembled a solemn vow. In the world he inhabited, debts were sacred things, written in blood and remembered forever. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Morgan caught one final glimpse of the street through the narrowing doors. Blackwood stood surrounded by leather-clad men, his posture rigid, scanning every corner as though he could will the shooter back into view. His voice carried clearly as the doors began to close. "Find him," he commanded, the words carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Whatever it takes." The fluorescent lights of Oak Ridge Memorial Hospital burned too bright against Morgan's retinas. She lay on the examination table, focusing on the ceiling tiles to manage the pain while a nurse cleaned and assessed the wound. The bullet had gone clean through her shoulder, a messy wound, but nothing vital had been hit. Lucky, the doctor had said. Morgan knew better. Luck had nothing to do with survival. "We'll give you something for the pain." The doctor offered a prescription pad already in hand. Morgan's refusal was immediate. "No opioids, nothing stronger than ibuprofen." The Dr. Young, probably straight out of residency, frowned. "Ms. Hayes, this is a significant trauma. You're going to be in considerable pain." "I'm familiar with pain management," she replied, her voice flat, "and with opioid dependence after battlefield injuries. No narcotics." Understanding dawned in the doctor's eyes as he took a closer look at her chart. Military, Navy, 12 years, FMF corpsman. The doctor's demeanor shifted subtly, professional respect replacing the mild condescension. "Fleet Marine Force. You've probably seen more trauma medicine than I have." Morgan didn't bother confirming. The scar tissue visible above her hospital gown told its own story, a roadmap of close calls and moments where luck, skill, or divine intervention had been the difference between life and death. "I'll step up the ibuprofen and add prescription-strength acetaminophen," the doctor conceded, "and a referral to our pain management specialist who works with veterans. She has non-narcotic protocols that might help." Morgan nodded, grateful for the respect shown to her decision. Too many of her brothers and sisters in arms had come home with wounds invisible to the eye, but no less debilitating PTSD, paired with opioid dependence, a combination that had claimed more lives after deployment than combat itself. As the medical team finished bandaging her shoulder, Morgan's mind drifted to the events that had led her to Oak Ridge. After her final tour in Afghanistan in 2015, the transition to civilian life had been harder than expected. The Navy had been her identity, her purpose. Without it, she'd floundered, drifting through temporary jobs and rented apartments across 3 states. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. A uniformed police officer entered, mid-30s, crew-cut, the careful posture of a man who'd spent time in the service before trading one uniform for another. "Officer Mike Brennan, Ms. Hayes, I need to get your statement about the shooting if you're up to it." Morgan recounted the events with military precision, time, location, details of the shooter, the sequence of actions. Nothing wasted, nothing embellished. "You said you spotted the gunman before he fired." Brennan noted, pen hovering above his notepad. "How boyo, light reflection from the barrel. I was scanning habit from deployment. Something didn't fit the pattern." "And you immediately moved to protect Mr. Blackwood. Did you know him?" "Never met him. Saw the threat, responded." Morgan's eyes met the officer's. "You served?" Brennan nodded. "Army. 2 tours in Iraq." "Then you understand." A moment of silent acknowledgement passed between them. The unspoken brotherhood of those who'd worn the uniform, who knew what it meant to react without hesitation when threats appeared. "The man you saved," Brennan said carefully, "James Blackwood. He's the president of the local Hells Angels chapter. Not exactly a model citizen in the eyes of the law." Morgan's expression remained neutral. "I didn't check his background before I pushed him out of the line of fire." Brennan's mouth twitched. "Fair enough. Just so you're aware, this might not be over. The shooter was likely connected to a rival club called the River Snakes. There's been tension between them and the Angels for months." "Not my concern," Morgan replied. "I did what anyone with my training would have done." The officer looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it. Well, the department appreciates your cooperation, Ms. Hayes. We'll need you to come in tomorrow or the next day to sign your official statement. After Brennan left, Morgan eased herself up, testing the limits of her injured shoulder. The pain flared bright and insistent, but manageable. She'd worked through worse. The sound of motorcycle engines rumbled in the parking lot below, a gathering force rather than departing individuals. Morgan moved to the window, careful not to strain her bandaged shoulder. At least a dozen Harleys were lined up in the hospital's parking lot, their riders dismounting in practiced unison. At the center stood Blackwood, his silver-streaked hair unmistakable, even from above. Morgan watched as a nurse approached the group, clearly attempting to enforce some hospital protocol about noise or parking. Blackwood spoke briefly to the woman, who nodded and retreated inside. No confrontation, no raised voices, just the quiet authority she glimpsed earlier. 20 minutes later, as Morgan was signing her discharge papers, there was another knock at the door. This time it was a nurse looking somewhat flustered. "Ms. Hayes, you have visitors, several of them. Hospital policy limits visitors to 2 at a time, but they're insistent on seeing you. A Mr. Blackwood says he won't leave until he's spoken with you." Morgan considered this. Let him in. Just him for now. When Blackwood entered, he seemed larger than life against the sterile backdrop of the hospital room. His leather vest was gone, likely still with the evidence technicians stained with her blood, but the faded Harley-Davidson t-shirt and worn jeans couldn't diminish his presence. He carried a simple bouquet of wildflowers, looking almost comically out of place in his weathered hands. "These seemed more your style than Rose's," he said, placing them on the bedside table. No greeting, no small talk, direct like she was. "Thank you." Morgan gestured to a chair. "You didn't need to come." "Yes, I did." Blackwood sat, his movements betraying old injuries, the slight favoring of his right knee, the careful way he eased into the chair. "What you did today, most people would have run for cover." Morgan shrugged, then winced as the movement pulled at her stitches. "Not how I'm wired. Military, Navy, corpsman, 12 years, 3 deployments to the sandbox." Blackwood nodded, unsurprised. "Thought so. You move like someone who's been downrange, combat trained." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with mutual assessment. "The man who shot at you," Morgan finally said. "You know who he is?" "Working on it. The river stakes have been pushing into our territory for months. Drugs primarily. We don't touch that poison." Morgan raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "The stereotype isn't entirely accurate, Ms. Hayes," Blackwood said with a hint of amusement. "We've had our troubles with the law, sure. But we don't deal drugs, and we protect our community. The snakes are different. They'll sell to teenagers, bring in harder stuff than weed. They're the ones willing to put a bullet in someone on a crowded street." "And now they've made it personal," Morgan observed. "Yes." The single word carried the weight of what would come next: retribution, justice, or whatever passed for it in his world. Blackwood reached into his pocket and withdrew a business card. Not what she'd expected. It bore only a phone number, no name or company. "If you need anything at all, you call this number. Day or night." He placed it on the table beside the flowers. "The angels take care of their own, and after today, you've earned that much." Morgan didn't reach for the card. "I didn't do it for your club, Mr. Blackwood." "James," he corrected. "And I know. You did it because that's who you are." He stood, movements careful but deliberate, which is exactly why the debt matters. He paused at the door. "You got a ride home?" "I'll manage." Blackwood shook his head. "There's a man named Razor waiting outside. Former Army Ranger. He'll see you home safely." Before Morgan could protest, he added, "Until we find the shooter, you're at risk. Not because of who you are, but because of what you did. Let us do this much." After he left, Morgan sat in silence, considering the card on the table. She'd spent her entire adult life following a code duty honor service. From what little she'd seen, Blackwood lived by a code too different in its specifics, but perhaps not in its foundations. She slipped the card into her pocket. Some debts, it seemed, were non-negotiable. The ride from the hospital was a study in contrast. Morgan Hayes, still in her blood-stained clothes, perched on the back of a meticulously maintained Harley-Davidson Street Glide, her good arm wrapped around the waist of a man who introduced himself simply as Razor. The motorcycle purred beneath them, the custom exhaust providing a bass rumble that vibrated through her chest. Oak Ridge slid by in the golden light of late-afternoon brick storefronts from the 1950s alongside modern chain stores, church steeples rising above fast food signs, all basking in the warm glow of the Arizona sunset. The town had grown up around the interstate in the nearby military installation, a place where different Americas overlapped and occasionally collided. Razor handled the bike with the precision of a man who'd spent more time on two wheels than four. There was something familiar in his movements, in the way he scanned intersections and maintained awareness of the vehicles around them, the hypervigilance that veterans carried home from war zones. He didn't attempt conversation over the engine's roar, which suited Morgan fine. The events of the day had left her drained, the adrenaline crash amplifying the pain in her shoulder. By the time they pulled up to her modest rental house on Sycamore Street, she was fighting to maintain her composure. "Need help getting inside?" Razor asked as he killed the engine. "I've got it," Morgan replied, easing herself off the bike with as much dignity as she could muster. "Thank you for the ride." Razor nodded, his expression hidden behind mirrored sunglasses. "Boss said to tell you he'll check in tomorrow, and to keep that number handy." After he rode away, Morgan stood for a moment in her small front yard listening to the Harley's diminishing growl. The neighborhood was quiet, modest, single-story homes with carports instead of garages, yards that ranged from meticulously maintained to respectably functional. Her place fell into the latter category, neat but unadorned. Inside, she moved directly to the bathroom, shedding her blood-stained shirt with careful movements. The bandage was holding, but the area around it had turned an angry red. She swallowed the prescription-strength ibuprofen dry, then leaned against the sink, studying her reflection. The woman who stared back had changed since her first deployment in 2003. The fresh-faced 20-year-old who joined the Navy to escape a dying Rust Belt town was long gone, replaced by someone harder, more contained. Eyes that had seen too much, a mouth that smiled too rarely. The scars, visible and invisible, told the story that her service record only hinted at. Morgan moved to the living room where a workbench occupied one corner. Leather pieces in various stages of completion were arranged neatly across the surface. A half-finished messenger bag, strips cut for belts, a motorcycle seat cover awaiting decorative stitching. Leatherworking had become her therapy, the repetitive actions of cutting, stamping, and stitching, providing a meditative focus that quieted the noise in her head. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, the third call from her father since the hospital had contacted him as her emergency contact. Robert Hayes wasn't a man who panicked easily, but getting word that his only child had been shot would test anyone's composure. "I'm fine, Dad," she said by way of greeting. "The hospital said you took a bullet." Robert's voice was steady, but she could hear the strain beneath it. At 78, he'd survived 2 heart attacks and a stroke, yet remained stubbornly independent in his small house across town. "Clean through and through, left shoulder, no major damage." "What happened?" The question came with the directness of a man who'd spent 30 years in the Marines before retiring as a master gunnery sergeant. No wasted words, no unnecessary emotion. Morgan gave him the abbreviated version, omitting the Hells Angels connection. Her father had strong opinions about motorcycle clubs, especially those with criminal histories. "You coming over tomorrow?" she asked, changing the subject. "Planned on it. Need to see for myself that you're in one piece." A pause. "You taking the painkillers they gave you?" "No narcotics," she answered. "Just the heavy-duty ibuprofen." "Good." The single word carried approval and shared understanding. Robert Hayes had seen too many good Marines lose themselves to pills after coming home wounded. "Need anything tonight?" "I'm set. Get some rest, old man." "Watch who you're calling old," he retorted, the familiar banter a comfort to them both. "Semper Fi, kid." "Semper Fi, Dad." After hanging up, Morgan eased herself onto the couch, propping her injured arm on a cushion. The television remained off. She preferred the quiet, had grown accustomed to it in the 3 years since leaving the service. Her thoughts turned to James Blackwood, to the debt he believed he owed her. In her 12 years of service, Morgan had learned to read people quickly, a survival skill in places where misplaced trust could be fatal. Blackwood carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, but there was something else there too, a sense of honor that transcended his outlaw appearance, a code that might not align with conventional society, but was no less rigid for that difference. Her doorbell rang just after 8 p.m., breaking her reverie. Caution made her check the peephole before opening the door to a young woman in a sheriff's department uniform. "Deputy Sarah Collins." The woman introduced herself, badge extended. Sheriff Parker asked me to stop by and check on you, Ms. Hayes. We're increasing patrols in your neighborhood tonight, given the circumstances. Morgan invited her in, noting the deputy's professional assessment of the house exits, sightlines potential vulnerabilities. Has there been any progress identifying the shooter? Morgan asked, offering the deputy a seat. Nothing concrete yet, Collins replied. But Sheriff Parker wanted me to update you on the situation with the motorcycle clubs. She pulled out a tablet, bringing up a file. The River Snakes are relatively new to the area, moved in about 18 months ago. They've been pushing the boundaries with the Hells Angels, whose chapter has been established here since the early 1990s. Morgan listened as the deputy outlined the growing tension between the club's territorial disputes, accusations of drug trafficking, incidents of intimidation that had stopped just short of open violence. Until today. The Angels have a complicated relationship with law enforcement, Collins continued. They operate in gray areas, but they generally keep the peace in their territory. The Snakes are different, more volatile, involved in harder drugs, willing to use violence as a first resort rather than a last one. And now I'm caught in the middle, Morgan observed. Potentially, Collins agreed. Blackwood is old school. He believes in debts and honor and taking care of his own. By saving him, you've created a connection he won't ignore. Morgan absorbed this, recognizing the implicit warning. I appreciate the concern, Deputy, but I can handle myself. Collins nodded, respecting the statement without challenging it. Here's my card. Sheriff Parker asked me to be your direct contact with the department. She hesitated. For what it's worth, the sheriff has known Blackwood for almost 30 years. Says if any man in the Angels has a moral compass, it's him. After the deputy left, Morgan locked the door and checked the window's old habits, from deployments where perimeter security meant survival. Her service weapon, a Sig Sauer P226, she was licensed to carry, resided in a fingerprint safe beside her bed. Tonight she moved it to the bedside table within easy reach. The events of the day replayed in her mind as she settled in for the night, shoulder throbbing despite the medication. The flash of sunlight on metal, the split-second decision, the crack of the gunshot, all of it felt strangely familiar, as though she'd simply transplanted her combat reflexes from Kandahar to Main Street Oak Ridge. What she couldn't reconcile was Blackwood's reaction. Not the gratitude. That was natural enough. It was the recognition she'd seen in his eyes, as though he'd looked at her and seen something beyond a stranger who'd taken a bullet meant for him. Like he knew her, or someone like her. That night, for the first time in months, the dreams came back, fragmented memories of firefights and field surgeries, of holding pressure on wounds while calling for medevac, of telling young Marines they'd be okay when she wasn't sure it was true. She woke before dawn, sheets damp with sweat, the phantom scent of cordite and copper in her nostrils. Some debts couldn't be repaid, some wounds never fully healed, and some instincts, once honed by war, never truly went dormant. Sunday morning dawned with the clarity particular to the desert's sharp-edged light that defined every surface it touched, shadows so deep they seemed solid. Morgan moved carefully through her morning routine, the simple tasks made complicated by her injured shoulder. Dressing took twice as long, coffee had to be made left-handed, and changing the bandage required contortions that pulled painfully at her stitches. By the time she'd settled at her small kitchen table, the local news was already running the story. A shooting on Main Street. A mysterious woman who'd saved the life of a known Hells Angels leader. Police seeking information on a suspect still at large. Her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Coming by at 11, need to talk. JB. Morgan checked the time, 9:17 a.m. Almost 2 hours to prepare for whatever conversation Blackwood deemed important enough for a personal visit. She spent the time productively cleaning her already tidy house and setting up her workbench so she could continue a leather project one-handed. The familiar routine centered her, pushed back the lingering edges of last night's dreams. Blackwood arrived precisely at 11, the rumble of his Harley announcing his presence before the doorbell rang. When Morgan opened the door, she found him alone, his bike the only one parked at the curb. He'd traded yesterday's blood-stained t-shirt for a clean black Henley that didn't quite hide the edge of old tattoos at his collar, and the leather vest cut she now noticed bore patches that told a story for those who knew how to read them. Ms. Hayes, he greeted her, removing his sunglasses to reveal eyes the color of winter sky. How's the shoulder? Functional, she replied, stepping back to allow him entry. Coffee, please. In her small kitchen, she poured him a mug with her good hand. Blackwood accepted it with a nod of thanks, taking in the simple, orderly space with quiet assessment. His gaze lingered on the workbench in the corner, the leather pieces arranged with military precision. "Nice work," he commented, nodding toward a half-finished shoulder holster. "Custom. Keeps my hands busy," Morgan answered. "Helps with the noise." Understanding flickered across Blackwood's weathered features. He knew about the static that filled a veteran's head in quiet moments. The memories that ambushed you when your guard dropped. "I came to bring you this," he said, reaching inside his cut to produce an envelope. "Medical bills can stack up fast. The club wants to cover whatever your insurance doesn't." Morgan made no move to take the envelope. "That's not necessary." "It is to us." Blackwood set the envelope on the counter, his expression making it clear the matter wasn't negotiable. "Second thing we know, who took the shot." This got her attention. "The police said they had no leads." "We have different sources," Blackwood replied with a slight shrug. "Guy's name is Tyler Grant. Former Army, did 2 tours in Iraq. Been riding with the River Snakes about 6 months. Morgan froze, the name striking a chord of recognition. Blackwood caught her reaction. "You know him?" It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "Not personally. I treated him once at a field hospital near Fallujah in 2005. Multiple shrapnel wounds from an IED. He was with the 10th Mountain Division." "Small world," Blackwood remarked, his tone carefully neutral. "He remembered you." Morgan considered this. "Doubtful. I was one of many corpsmen who treated casualties. He was in and out of consciousness most of the time." She paused. "But if he's targeting you, it's unlikely to be a coincidence that I was there." "Agreed," Blackwood said grimly, "which means you're still in danger. The Snakes might decide you're a loose end, especially if Grant told them about your intervention." Morgan met his gaze directly. "I can handle myself, Mr. Blackwood." "James," he corrected again, "and I don't doubt your capabilities, Ms. Hayes, but there's a difference between a firefight with clear enemies and living in a town where threats might come from any direction." He had a point, though she was reluctant to acknowledge it. In combat, the parameters were defined. You knew who was on your side, who wasn't, and what the objectives were. Civilian life was messier, the lines blurred. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "Protection." Blackwood answered simply. "We have men who can keep an eye on your place, make sure Grant or his friends don't pay you an unwelcome visit." "I appreciate the offer, but I've had enough surveillance in my life," Morgan replied. "I'm not looking to trade my privacy for security." Blackwood studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Fair enough, but take this at least." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small device that resembled a key fob. "Panic button. Signal goes directly to our clubhouse and to Razor's phone. Response time under 3 minutes, day or night." This seemed a reasonable compromise. Morgan accepted the device, tucking it into her jeans pocket. "Thank you." An unexpected knock at the door interrupted them. Morgan moved to answer it, hand instinctively checking for the weapon that wasn't at her hip. Old habits. Through the peephole, she saw a man in a khaki sheriff's department uniform, tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair cropped close to his scalp. When she opened the door, he removed his hat in a gesture that belonged to an earlier generation. "Ms. Hayes, Sheriff Raymond Parker. Hope I'm not intruding." Before she could respond, Blackwood appeared at her shoulder. "Ray," he acknowledged, surprising Morgan with the familiar address. "James," the sheriff returned evenly. "Figured I might find you here." The two men regarded each other with what Morgan recognized as the complex respect of old adversaries. Not friends exactly, but not strangers either. There was history there, decades of it, by the look of them. "Come in, Sheriff," she offered, stepping back. In her living room, the dynamic became clearer. Parker and Blackwood were roughly the same age, late 50s to early 60s, and carried themselves with similar authority, though the sources differed. The sheriff's came from his badge and the weight of law. Blackwood's from something more primal, earned rather than granted. "I came to update you on the investigation," Parker said, addressing Morgan while keeping Blackwood in his peripheral vision. "But I'm guessing the Angels are running their own inquiries." "Just looking out for someone who took a bullet meant for one of our own," Blackwood replied mildly. Parker turned to Morgan. "Ms. Hayes, I should inform you that associating with known members of outlaw motorcycle clubs can complicate your standing with law enforcement." Morgan's expression cooled. "With respect, Sheriff, I'm aware of the legal implications. I'm also aware that I have the right to speak with whoever I choose in my own home." The sheriff studied her, reassessing. Military background. Navy. FMF corpsman. 3 deployments. Parker nodded, something shifting in his demeanor. My son's a corpsman, stationed at Camp Pendleton. The shared connection eased the tension slightly. Parker turned back to Blackwood. We've identified the shooter, Tyler Grant, 34, former Army dishonorable discharge in 2006 for assaulting an officer. Been with the River Snakes since they moved into the area. We know, Blackwood said. What you probably don't know is why he targeted me specifically. Parker raised an eyebrow. Enlighten me. The Snakes want to move more product through Oak Ridge, fentanyl primarily. We've been blocking them, making it clear that kind of business isn't welcome here. Grant was likely trying to prove himself to Viper. Eric Viper Miller, Parker clarified for Morgan's benefit. President of the River Snakes. Bad news from way back, did time for aggravated assault and drug trafficking in California before setting up shop here. Cool, man, you let them, Morgan asked the question directed at both men. Constitutional rights apply to everyone, Ms. Hayes, Parker replied. We can watch them build cases when they break laws, but we can't run them out of town for existing. Meanwhile, they're poisoning your community, Blackwood added, targeting kids, veterans, anyone vulnerable. 26 overdose deaths in the county this year alone. The statistic hung in the air, a damning indictment of a war being fought and lost in small towns across America. Morgan thought of the veterans she'd known who'd come home only to lose themselves to addiction, pain management, that turned into dependency, searching for chemical peace when the real thing proved elusive. I should warn you both, Parker said after a moment. Grant hasn't been seen at the Snakes clubhouse since yesterday. His apartment's empty, motorcycle gone. He's in the wind. Or dead, Blackwood suggested. The Snakes don't tolerate failure. Either way, Parker continued, focusing on Morgan. You should remain cautious. Your intervention made you a player in this situation, whether you wanted that role or not. Understood, Morgan replied, the familiar weight of vigilance is settling back onto her shoulders. In the field, you learn to live with the constant awareness of threat to function despite it. Some part of her had missed that clarity, the sharp focus that danger brought. After the sheriff left, Blackwood remained, his expression troubled. He's right, he said finally. You're involved now, regardless of your intentions. Morgan met his gaze steadily. I made my choice when I saw that gun. Everything after is just consequence. Blackwood studied her with that same searching look from the hospital, as though he were seeing someone else superimposed over her features, a ghost from his past. You remind me of someone, he said quietly. Same kind of steel in the spine. Same willingness to step between danger and others. Morgan said nothing, waiting. The club is meeting tonight, Blackwood continued, planning our response to this situation. I'd like you to be there. The invitation surprised her. Why? Because Grant was aiming at me but might come for you next. Because you've earned a voice in what happens. And because I think you're the kind of person who prefers action to waiting. He wasn't wrong. The prospect of sitting at home watching windows and jumping at shadows held no appeal. Better to understand the players and the stakes, to have some agency in what came next. What time? She asked. 8 o'clock. I'll send Razor to pick you up. Blackwood moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Ms. Hayes. The club respects what you did, but they'll have questions. They'll want to know if you can be trusted. And can I? The question was pointed, deliberate. Trust goes both ways, he answered. I'm betting on you because my instincts say you're solid. Don't make me regret that. After he left, Morgan stood in her quiet house, considering the rapidly shifting landscape of her life. 24 hours ago, she'd been anonymous in this town, just another veteran trying to build a civilian life from the pieces left after service. Now she was connected to a shooting, to a motorcycle club, to a drug war she hadn't known was being fought in her community. The smart move would be to step back, to let law enforcement handle the situation. But Morgan Hayes hadn't survived 3 deployments by making the safe choice. She'd lived by putting herself between danger and those who couldn't protect themselves. That instinct hadn't died when she'd taken off the uniform. She moved to her bedroom and opened the fingerprint safe beside her bed. The Sig Sauer P226 lay inside, cleaned and oiled, ready. Next to it was a smaller box containing her service medals, the Navy Cross Bronze Star and Purple Heart among them. Tangible reminders of a life defined by duty and sacrifice. Tonight she would step back into a world where violence was currency and loyalty was everything. Not so different, perhaps, from the battlefield she'd left behind. The enemy had changed, the terrain had shifted, but the fundamental reality remained the same. There were those who preyed upon others and those who stood in their way. Morgan Hayes had always known which side she was on. The sun had begun its descent behind the western mountains when Razor arrived at Morgan's house. The shadows stretched long across her front yard, painting the world in amber and indigo. He pulled up on the same street glide from the day before, engine purring with a deep mechanical certainty. Morgan was waiting, dressed in dark jeans boots and a black button-down shirt that hung loose enough to accommodate her bandaged shoulder. A leather jacket, one of her own creations, was draped over her good arm. "How's the wing?" Razor asked as she approached, genuine concern in his weathered face. "Functional," Morgan replied, the same answer she'd given Blackwood earlier. "No complaints, no drama, the military way." She settled behind Razor with practiced ease, her injured arm tucked close to her body, the other wrapped securely around his waist. As they pulled away from the curb, Morgan felt the familiar rush that came with acceleration on two wheels. She'd owned a motorcycle during her service years, a stripped-down Honda CB750 she'd rebuilt herself between deployments. There was something about the exposure, the immediacy of the experience that spoke to her. No barriers between you and the world rushing past, nowhere to hide, nothing to do but commit fully to each moment. The Hells Angels clubhouse wasn't what she'd expected. Located on the outskirts of town, the compound occupied what had once been an auto repair garage. The main building was solid brick, flanked by a large metal workshop and a gravel lot already filled with motorcycles, at least 50, by Morgan's quick count, with more arriving as they pulled in. Razor guided the bike to a spot near the entrance where Blackwood stood talking with two men whose cuts marked them as officers in the club. At their approach, he turned, nodding in greeting. "Ms. Hayes," he said, offering his hand to help her dismount. "Glad you could make it." "Morgan," she corrected, stepping off the bike without assistance. "If we're going to be in this together, first names seem appropriate." A slight smile tugged at Blackwood's mouth. "Morgan, then." He gestured to the men beside him. "This is Wrench, our sergeant-at-arms, and Doc, our treasurer." Wrench was a bull of a man, 6'4" and solid, with a shaved head and hands that looked like they could bend steel. Doc was his opposite, lean and wiry, with intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that seemed incongruous with his leather cut. "Ma'am," Wrench acknowledged with unexpected formality. "Military background," Morgan guessed. "Pleasure," Doc added with a slight nod. "Blackwood says you're a corpsman. I was a medic with the 101st Airborne." The connection established, they moved inside. The clubhouse interior surprised Morgan again. Instead of the dark, smoke-filled den, she'd imagined the space was well-lit and organized. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, surrounded by mismatched chairs. The walls were covered with club memorabilia, photographs, patches, and framed news clippings chronicling decades of Hells Angels history. A worn American flag hung prominently at one end of the room, flanked by military service banners. Beneath them, a memorial wall displayed photographs of fallen members, many in uniform from various eras. Morgan recognized the silent tribute for what it was, a brotherhood remembering its own. The room was filling quickly with men in leather cuts, their patches telling stories of rank and road experience. Morgan noted the demographics with interest, primarily men in their 40s to 60s, with a few younger prospects moving among them, serving drinks and showing deference to the older members. Not so different from the military hierarchy she'd known. A vintage Wurlitzer jukebox in the corner played Creedence Clearwater Revival, the familiar chords of Fortunate Son floating over the rumble of conversation. The scent of brewing coffee mingled with leather and motor oil, not unpleasant, just distinctly masculine and utilitarian. Blackwood led Morgan to the table, indicating a seat near the head. The symbolism wasn't lost on her. He was placing her in a position of respect within the club's structure, making a statement without words. "Coffee," he offered as the room continued to fill. "Black," she confirmed, settling into the chair with her back to the wall, another combat habit that never quite faded. As the final members filed in, Morgan counted nearly 30 men in the clubhouse itself. Through the open doors, she could see dozens more in the lot outside, their bikes continuing to arrive in a steady stream. The energy in the room shifted, conversation dying down as Blackwood moved to the head of the table. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "Most of you know why we're here. Yesterday on Main Street in broad daylight, a river snake took a shot at me." A murmur of anger rippled through the assembly. "He missed," Blackwood continued, "because this woman," he gestured to Morgan, saw it coming and put herself between me and the bullet. She took a round through the shoulder that was meant for my heart. All eyes turned to Morgan assessing measuring. Morgan Hayes Blackwood introduced her. 12 years as a Navy corpsman, 3 combat deployments. She doesn't know our world, and she has no dog in our fight with the snakes. But she acted without hesitation when she saw one of us in danger. He paused, letting that sink in. For that, she's earned our respect and our protection. A man halfway down the table spoke up. We know who pulled the trigger. Tyler Grant, Blackwood confirmed. Former Army dishonorable discharge. Been riding with the snakes about 6 months. Another voice from the back of the room. He in the wind. Gone from his apartment. Bike missing. Sheriff's got nothing. Doc leaned forward, fingers steepled. Viper wouldn't let him run, not after failing a hit like this. Either he's hiding him or he's already dead, Wrench finished bluntly. Viper cleans his own messes. The discussion continued, detailing the river snake's movements over recent months. Territory encroachment, drug distribution, networks, recruitment efforts targeting veterans and ex-cons. Morgan listened closely, building a mental map of the conflict. This wasn't just about motorcycle clubs. It was about power profit and competing codes of conduct. The Angels operated with a set of boundaries: no dealing to kids, no fentanyl, no random violence. The Snakes recognized no such limits. We've confirmed they're bringing in product from the South, Blackwood was saying. Fentanyl pressed to look like oxy, pure enough to kill with a quarter tablet. 26 deaths in the county already this year. Morgan watched the faces around the table harden at the number. These men weren't strangers to the toll of addiction. Many had likely lost brothers to it, both in the club and in uniform. Tonight, Blackwood continued, we send a message. 120 bikes, full colors rolling through their territory. We show strength, unity, and purpose. He turned to Morgan. I invited you here because what happens next concerns you too. Grant failed his mission. That makes you and me loose ends. Morgan nodded, understanding perfectly. In combat, failed operations created vulnerability. Enemies sought to tie off loose threads, eliminate witnesses, cover tracks. I appreciate the heads up, she said, but I can handle myself. A few skeptical glances were exchanged around the table. Morgan felt rather than saw them, the silent assessment of her capabilities based on gender and size rather than experience. Blackwood seemed to sense it too. Ms. Hayes received the Navy Cross for actions during an ambush in Helmand Province. She treated 17 wounded Marines under fire, then picked up a rifle and held off insurgents until air support arrived. He paused. I checked. Her record speaks for itself. The atmosphere in the room shifted subtly, respect, replacing skepticism, recognition of a kindred spirit, despite the different uniform. What's your take on this? Morgan, Blackwood asked, surprising her with the direct invitation to participate. You've got combat experience and an outside perspective. What are we missing? Morgan considered the question, carefully aware of the weight of 30 pairs of eyes on her. In Afghanistan, she began, we tracked insurgent networks by following resources and communication patterns. The Snakes need supply lines, distribution networks, and protection for both. Cut off any of those, and they're vulnerable. She leaned forward slightly. But your show of force tonight, it's not just about them. It's about the community, isn't it? About showing Oak Ridge who really stands between them and the poison the Snakes are bringing in. Blackwood's expression confirmed her assessment. The town needs to see who's really fighting for them, he agreed. Not just for our sake, but so they know who to trust, who to call if the Snakes come knocking. A prospect entered the room, moving directly to Blackwood to whisper something in his ear. The club president's expression darkened. Confirmation from our source inside the sheriff's department, he announced. Tyler Grant was found 30 minutes ago, beaten, shot twice, dumped behind the old Phillips factory on the south side. A grim silence settled over the room. Dead, someone asked. Not yet. Critical condition at County General. Sheriff Parker's got deputies on the door. The implications hung heavy in the air. Grant hadn't fled. He'd been punished by his own club for failing his mission. But he'd been left alive, deliberately it seemed, which meant something else was in play. It's a message, Morgan said, the realization clicking into place. To us. To you. She looked at Blackwood. They're saying they handle their own discipline, that Grant's failure doesn't change their intentions. They still want you dead and they're not backing down. Wrench nodded slowly. Makes sense. They're doubling down, showing they're not afraid of retaliation. Then our response tonight matters even more, Blackwood concluded. We show strength but discipline. No direct confrontation unless they force it. This isn't about starting a war, it's about making it clear we'll finish one if necessary. He rose from his seat, signaling the end of the discussion. Foyin, kick stands up in 30 minutes. Full colors formation, riding communications check before we roll. Razor, you're a riding point with me. Wrench, you've got rear guard. Doc, coordinate the medical supplies just in case. The room erupted into purposeful activity, men checking radios, adjusting gear, moving with the practiced efficiency of those accustomed to mobilizing quickly. Morgan found herself standing apart, observing the orchestrated chaos with professional appreciation. These men might not wear uniforms in the traditional sense, but they operated with military precision nonetheless. Blackwood approached her as the room emptied, members filing out to their bikes. You don't have to come, he said quietly. Razor can take you home, set up protection until this blows over. Morgan met his gaze steadily. I've never been good at sitting on the sidelines, James. Didn't think so, he replied with the ghost of a smile. I've got a spare helmet that should fit. You'll ride with me. Outside, the staging area had transformed. 120 Harleys lined up in precise formation, 2x2 engines, silent for the moment, riders standing at attention beside their machines. The discipline was impressive, a testament to Blackwood's leadership and the club's internal structure. As they emerged from the clubhouse, a path cleared for them through the assembled riders. Morgan felt the weight of their collective gaze, not hostile, but evaluating, measuring her worth against their code. She walked tall despite the ache in her shoulder, letting them see the steel in her spine. Blackwood's bike stood at the head of the formation, a meticulously maintained Road King from the mid-90s, its black paint and chrome gleaming under the lot lights. The machine was a testament to American engineering and decades of careful maintenance, not a showpiece but a working machine with battle scars and hard-earned patina. 1995, Morgan asked, as Blackwood handed her a matte black helmet. He glanced at her, surprised by the accurate sentiment. Good eye, original owner, 128,000 miles and counting. Morgan ran her fingers along the fuel tank, appreciating the craftsmanship. My dad had a 97, taught me to ride on it when I was 16. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place for Blackwood, her comfort with motorcycles, her easy adaptation to this world that should have been foreign to her. As Morgan settled behind him on the wide leather seat, Blackwood raised his hands, signaling to the formation. One by one, engines roared to life, the combined thunder of 120 American-made V-twins vibrating through the night air like a primal call to arms. The sound was physical, a pressure wave that Morgan felt in her chest and her bones. It spoke to something ancient and visceral, a tribal gathering that transcended the modern trappings of leather and chrome. These were warriors assembling a brotherhood, preparing to defend its territory and its code. With a final signal, Blackwood dropped his hand and the formation began to move. The precision was remarkable, each bike maintaining perfect spacing, riders moving as a single organism, a steel serpent flowing out onto the highway with purpose and power. As they gained speed, Morgan felt the night air whipping past, carrying the scent of desert sage and gasoline. The stars overhead blazed in the clear Arizona sky, ancient and indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath them. For the first time since taking the bullet meant for Blackwood, she felt truly alive, connected to something larger than herself. The formation thundered through Oak Ridge's quiet streets, drawing citizens to windows and porches despite the late hour. They moved through the town center, past the diner where the shooting had occurred, and toward the southern district where the river snakes claimed territory. Morgan felt the change as they crossed the invisible boundary tension, rippling through the formation, riders scanning rooftops and alleyways with increased vigilance. They were in hostile territory now, making a statement with every block they covered. The Snakes clubhouse came into view, a converted warehouse with motorcycles parked haphazardly outside. Unlike the disciplined formation of the Angels, the Snakes' bikes stood in disarray, mirroring the chaotic nature of their organization. Figures emerged from the building as the Angels approached, drawn by the unmistakable sound of 120 Harleys moving in formation. They stood watching, outnumbered and outflanked, as Blackwood led his brothers past their headquarters, a at a deliberate, unhurried pace. No words were exchanged, no gestures offered. None were needed. The message was in the numbers, the discipline, the unity of purpose. The angels were showing exactly what the snakes would face if they continued down their current path. As they completed their circuit of snake territory, Morgan caught sight of something unexpected: residents of the neighborhood standing on porches and street corners, watching the procession with expressions that ranged from curiosity to relief. These weren't people who feared the angels. These were citizens who recognized them as a counterbalance to the predatory presence of the snakes. The formation turned north, heading back toward angel territory. They had made their statement, displayed their strength without a single word being spoken or a single act of aggression committed. It was power projected through presence alone, the oldest and most effective form of deterrence. Morgan leaned forward slightly, speaking into Blackwood's ear over the rumble of engines. They were watching. Not just the snakes, the neighborhood. He nodded, understanding her meaning. This wasn't just about intimidating rivals. It was about reassuring a community, about showing the people of Oak Ridge, who truly stood between them and the darkness that threatened to engulf their town. As they approached the clubhouse once more, Blackwood unexpectedly signaled a turn, breaking from the main formation with a handful of riders following his lead. Morgan held tighter as they accelerated onto the highway, heading east toward the mountains that loomed dark against the night sky. 10 minutes later, they pulled into a scenic overlook, cutting engines as they came to rest. Below them, Oak Ridge spread out like a constellation of earthbound stars, streetlights and homes creating patterns of illumination against the desert darkness. Blackwood removed his helmet, running a hand through silver-streaked hair as he gazed down at the town. The riders who had followed Razordock Wrench and 3 others Morgan didn't know by name gathered around a loose semicircle facing the view. "Pretty from up here," Razor observed, lighting a cigarette. The flame briefly illuminated his face, younger than Morgan had first thought, perhaps early 40s, with the hard-earned lines of a man who'd seen too much. "Worth protecting," Blackwood agreed. He turned to Morgan. "Thought you should see it like this. Helps maintain perspective on what we're fighting for." She understood. From this vantage point, Oak Ridge wasn't just buildings and streets. It was homes, lives, a community that had existed before any of them were born and would continue long after they were gone. The angels saw themselves as guardians of something larger than their club, something that gave purpose to their existence beyond the brotherhood they'd formed. "The snakes don't see it that way," Morgan observed. "For them, it's just territory, a market for their product." "That's the fundamental difference," Doc agreed, his voice carrying the measured cadence of an educated man. "We're part of this town, have been for 30 years. The snakes are parasites. They take without giving back, destroy without creating." The philosophical distinction surprised Morgan, though it shouldn't have. These men weren't the one-dimensional outlaws portrayed in media. They were complex individuals bound by a code that, while outside conventional society, still contained its own form of honor and purpose. "What happens next?" she asked, directing the question to Blackwood, but including the others with her gaze. "We wait," he answered simply. "Ball's in their court now. They can back off, respect boundaries, or they can escalate. Either way, we'll be ready." The weight of what that readiness might entail hung in the cool night air. These men weren't strangers to violence, to the harsh realities of their chosen path. Neither was Morgan, though her battlefield had been different. In the end, conflict followed the same fundamental patterns, whether in the mountains of Afghanistan or the streets of an Arizona town. As they mounted up to return to the clubhouse, Morgan caught Blackwood studying her with that same searching look she'd noted before, as though he were seeing someone else in her features, measuring her against a memory he couldn't quite reconcile. "You remind me of someone," he said, finally echoing his earlier comment. "Someone I owe a debt to that can never be repaid." Morgan waited, sensing there was more to come. "Maybe that's why I was meant to meet you," Blackwood continued, his voice barely audible over the idle of their bikes. "Second chances are rare in this life. Opportunities to balance the scales even rarer." Before she could respond, he kicked his bike into gear and pulled away, leaving her to wonder about the ghost that haunted a man who seemed on the surface to fear nothing and regret less. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor hues when Morgan finally returned home, the night's events settling into her bones like old friends. Exhaustion pulled at her, but it was the familiar fatigue of purpose rather than the hollow weariness that had characterized too many of her civilian days. Her injured shoulder throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a persistent reminder of how quickly life could change course. She moved through her morning routine on autopilot, coffee brewing, bandage change painkillers measured out with military precision. The house felt different somehow, as though her brief immersion in the angel's world had altered her perception of her own sanctuary. It seemed smaller now, more isolated, a fortress built against connections rather than for them. The knock at her door came as she was finishing her coffee. Through the peephole, she recognized the weathered face of her father, Robert Hayes, his expression set in the stoic mask he'd worn since her mother's death a decade earlier. "Heard you went for a ride last night," he said by way of greeting, stepping inside with the careful movements of a man whose body no longer obeyed his commands with the precision he demanded. At 78, Robert remained imposing 6'2" of solid Marine, his posture military straight, despite the arthritis that gnawed at his spine. "Word travels fast," Morgan observed, pouring him a cup of coffee. Black, no sugar, the same way she took hers. "Small town." Robert settled into a kitchen chair, his pale blue eyes so like her own, taking in her bandaged shoulder and the shadows beneath her eyes. "Sheriff Parker called me this morning. Seems concerned about the company you're keeping." Morgan leaned against the counter, weighing her response. Her father had strong opinions about motorcycle clubs shaped by his years in law enforcement after retiring from the Marines. She'd never lied to him, didn't intend to start now. "The Angels are involved because their president was the target," she explained. "I'm involved because I stepped between him and a bullet. And last night's parade through town, where does that fit in your involvement?" News traveled even faster than she'd thought. Show of force against the river snakes, letting them know the Angels won't be intimidated. Robert sipped his coffee, digesting this. "Parker says the shooter's in critical condition at County, found beaten half to death behind the old Phillips factory." "The snakes punished him for failing," Morgan confirmed. "Left him alive as a message to Blackwood that they're not backing down." A flicker of respect crossed her father's face at her analysis. He taught her to think strategically, to see patterns in human conflict, to understand the language of violence that underpinned so many human interactions. "You know who James Blackwood is?" Robert asked, his tone careful. "What he's been involved in over the years. I know he leads the local Angels. I know he has boundaries, no dealing to kids, no fentanyl, no random violence. And I know he's fighting to keep the snakes from flooding this town with drugs that are killing people." Robert studied her over the rim of his coffee cup. "You've done your homework." Seemed prudent given the circumstances. A silence stretched between them, comfortable in its familiarity. They'd never been people who filled empty air with meaningless chatter. "Blackwood served," Robert said finally. "Desert Storm, Army Rangers, decorated for actions during a mission that went sideways near the Kuwait border." This was news to Morgan. Blackwood hadn't mentioned his military service directly, though she'd recognized the bearing the command presence that came from having men's lives in your hands. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Looked him up years ago when the Angels first established their chapter here. Always good to know who's operating in your backyard." Robert set his cup down. He was a staff sergeant, led a squad that got cut off during an advance, brought every one of his men back alive. The information added another layer to her understanding of Blackwood, his leadership style, the respect his men showed him, the discipline he maintained within the club. Not just an outlaw biker, but a combat veteran who'd carried the lessons of war into civilian life, applying them to a different kind of battlefield. "He ever mentioned knowing you?" Morgan asked, a possibility forming in her mind. Robert's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Why do you ask?" "Something he said, about me reminding him of someone he owed a debt to." Her father's gaze dropped to his coffee cup, his weathered hands wrapping around it as though seeking warmth despite the Arizona heat already building outside. "Gulf War 1991, he said after a long moment. "I was a gunnery sergeant with 1st Recon. We got attached to an Army Ranger unit for a special op near the Kuwait border. Things went bad, intelligence failure, enemy strength underestimated. We got pinned down in a wadi taking heavy fire from 3 sides." Morgan listened intently. Her father rarely spoke about his combat experiences, preferring to keep those memories locked away where they couldn't touch his civilian life. "Staff Sergeant Blackwood was there," Robert continued, "leading a squad that was supposed to provide our extract. When the shooting started, they were still a click away. Protocol said they should have waited for air support maintain position. Blackwood didn't wait. He brought his men straight into the firefight, created a corridor for us to withdraw through. He paused, the memory playing across his face like a shadow. We were carrying wounded, moving slow. Blackwood's position was exposed, no cover worth mentioning. They took casualties holding that line, but they didn't break. They gave us the time we needed to get our people out. The pieces began to align in Morgan's mind. Blackwood's recognition of her, the debt he'd mentioned, the way he'd looked at her as though seeing a ghost. You saved him, she guessed. Robert nodded slowly. Sniper on a ridge we hadn't cleared. Had Blackwood in his sights. I saw the glint off the scope just like you did on Main Street. Got my shot off first. He looked up, meeting her eyes. Like father, like daughter, it seems. The parallel was almost eerie, both Hayes' father and daughter, spotting a hidden threat and acting to save a man they didn't know decades apart, but connected by the same instinctive response to danger. He never mentioned knowing you, Morgan said. We weren't formally introduced, Robert explained. Different units, chaos of combat. He probably knew my rank and name from reports afterward, but we never spoke. I rotated back to the States a week later, finished my tour at Pendleton. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. That's why he looked at me like he was seeing someone else. I reminded him of you. Possible, Robert conceded. The Hayes eyes are distinctive. Your mother always said they were like looking into winter sky. Morgan absorbed this new information, reevaluating her interactions with Blackwood through this additional lens. His insistence on paying her medical bills, his protective instincts, his immediate trust in her judgment, all of it colored by a 30-year-old debt he believed he owed her family. Does this change how you feel about my involvement? She asked her father directly. Robert considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. Blackwood's not the devil Parker makes him out to be, but he's still the president of an outlaw motorcycle club, still operates outside the law when it suits him. He paused. That said, if the choice is between the Angels and the river snakes having influence in this town, I know which one I'd choose. Coming from her law and order father, this was as close to approval as she was likely to get. Morgan felt something ease in her chest, a tension she hadn't fully acknowledged until it released. The shooter Tyler Grant, she said, changing tack slightly. I treated him once in Iraq, multiple shrapnel wounds from an IED near Fallujah. Robert's eyebrows rose. Small world. Too small for coincidence, Morgan replied. I think he recognized me at some point. Maybe saw me around town place the face, and decided to take you both out with one bullet, Robert concluded grimly. 2 birds, 1 stone. The tactical assessment was chilling but likely accurate. Grant hadn't just been aiming at Blackwood. He'd recognized an opportunity to eliminate 2 potential threats. Morgan wondered how long he'd been watching her, planning his moment. The snakes won't back down after last night, Robert warned. Men like that can't afford to lose face. They'll retaliate, try to reassert dominance. I know, Morgan acknowledged. Blackwood knows it too. They're preparing. Robert studied her with the penetrating gaze that had seen through her excuses and evasions since childhood. And where do you stand in all this? You've taken your bullet, done your good deed. You could walk away, let them fight their war without you. It was a fair question, one she'd asked herself during the long night of rumbling engines and silent statements of power. She could retreat to the safety of her quiet life, let the conflict play out without her involvement. The sensible choice, the safe choice. But that had never been her way. I can't walk away, she said simply. Not when I know what's at stake, not when I know I can make a difference. Robert nodded, unsurprised by her answer. He'd raised her to face challenges head-on, to stand for what she believed in, regardless of personal cost. He might not approve of the company she was keeping, but he understood her decision. Then you do what you have to do, he said, rising from his chair with the careful movements of a man whose body had endured more than its share of hardship. Just remember, these aren't insurgents in Afghanistan. They're not bound by rules of engagement or military codes. The snakes will fight dirty because that's all they know. So will the Angels, Morgan pointed out. Yeah, Robert agreed. But Blackwood still carries his military training whether he admits it or not. He has limits, lines he won't cross. He moved toward the door, then paused. Men like Viper Miller don't recognize limits. Remember that when you're choosing sides. After her father left, Morgan stood in her kitchen, turning over the new information like a puzzle piece that changed the entire picture. Blackwood and her father connected by a moment of combat brotherhood 3 decades earlier. Herself and Grant linked by another battlefield an ocean away. The web of connections stretched across time and distance, creating a tapestry of cause and effect that had led to a bullet in her shoulder in a town on the brink of a drug war. Her phone chimed with an incoming text. Meeting at the clubhouse 2 p.m. Important developments. Just JB. Morgan checked the time. 11:37 a.m. Enough time to shower, change, and gather her thoughts before diving back into the angel's world. She moved toward the bathroom, then stopped as another realization struck her. Blackwood knew who she was, or at least whose daughter she was. He'd recognized her haze eyes, the family resemblance strong enough to connect her to a Marine he'd seen briefly during the chaos of combat 3 decades earlier. Yet he hadn't mentioned it, hadn't used that connection to manipulate her involvement. Why keep that knowledge to himself? Was it respect for her autonomy, allowing her to make decisions without the weight of family obligation? Or something more complicated? Shame perhaps at owing a debt he couldn't repay, at being saved by a man whose daughter now stood in harm's way because of him. These questions followed Morgan into the shower, where hot water stung her wounded shoulder and failed to wash away the growing certainty that she was now irreversibly connected to whatever came next in the conflict between the angels and the snakes. Not just as a bystander who'd intervened, but as the daughter of a man to whom James Blackwood believed he owed his life. Some debts transcended time. Some obligations passed from one generation to the next. And some battles, it seemed, were fought across decades, with new soldiers taking up old causes in an endless cycle of honor, duty, and blood. The clubhouse parking lot was nearly empty when Morgan arrived at 2 p.m. sharp. Only a handful of motorcycles lined up where the previous night had seen over 100. She recognized Blackwood's Road King among them, its distinctive custom paint job catching the afternoon sun. Inside, the atmosphere was dramatically different from the previous night's gathering. Gone was the charged energy of men preparing for a show of force. In its place was something more focused, more deliberate, the quiet intensity of strategic planning rather than tactical execution. Blackwood sat at the head of the table, deep in conversation with Sheriff Raymond Parker. The sight of the law enforcement officer in the heart of the Angels' territory was jarring enough that Morgan paused in the doorway, reassessing the situation. Doc and Wrench flanked Blackwood, while Razor stood slightly apart, arms crossed, watching the exchange with guarded expression. It was Parker who noticed her first, raising his gaze from the documents spread across the table. "Ms. Hayes," he acknowledged with a pun. "Glad you could join us." Blackwood turned the lines around his eyes deeper than they had been yesterday. "Morgan," he greeted her. "Come in. Things have developed overnight." She approached the table, noting the maps and photographs scattered across its surface. Surveillance photos of the River Snakes Clubhouse County property records and what appeared to be police reports created a mosaic of intelligence gathering. "Sheriff Parker's here in an unofficial capacity," Blackwood explained, answering her unspoken question. "We have mutual interests at the moment." Parker's expression suggested this alliance was temporary and pragmatic rather than comfortable. "Tyler Grant regained consciousness this morning," he said without preamble. "Gave a statement before being placed in medically induced coma for surgery." And Morgan prompted, sensing there was more. "And it appears the River Snakes operation is larger than we thought," Parker continued. "Grant claims they're moving product through 3 counties using veterans support groups as distribution networks." The targeting of veterans hit Morgan like a physical blow. She'd seen too many of her brothers and sisters in arms fall to addiction after returning home, pain management that spiraled into dependency, self-medication for PTSD, the search for chemical peace when the real thing proved elusive. "How?" she asked, her voice tight. "Veterans groups have safeguards protocols. They're infiltrating legitimate organizations," Parker explained. "Placing members who've served as volunteers, establishing trust, then using that access to identify vulnerable veterans, those with chronic pain, PTSD, limited support systems." The strategy was as brilliant as it was despicable, targeting those already struggling with transition to civilian life, exploiting their pain and isolation to create customers whose addiction would ensure repeat business. "That's not all," Blackwood added grimly. "According to Grant, Viper's been specifically recruiting veterans with combat experience, men with tactical training and weapons proficiency. He's building a paramilitary force, not just a drug distribution network. The implications were chilling. A criminal organization with military training could escalate beyond typical gang violence into something far more dangerous, coordinated, disciplined, strategic. "What's the sheriff's department doing about this?" Morgan asked Parker directly. "What we can with limited resources," he replied, a hint of defensiveness in his tone. "Grant's testimony gives us enough for search warrants, but Viper's careful. He keeps his hands clean, uses cutouts for the dirty work. We need more than the word of a failed hitman to make charges stick." "Which is where we come in," Blackwood interjected. "The Angels have connections Grant doesn't know about, former members who've moved on but still honor the Brotherhood. One of them works at the VA hospital where many of these veterans are being targeted." Morgan began to see the shape of their alliance. Parker needed intelligence he couldn't legally obtain, and the Angels had access to information channels outside official scrutiny, a marriage of convenience in service of a greater good. "There's something else you should know," Parker said, his gaze shifting to Morgan. "Grant mentioned you specifically in his statement. Said Viper ordered him to take care of the medic after dealing with Blackwood." The confirmation of her earlier theory sent a chill through Morgan's core. Not a random encounter, not an accidental intervention, but a targeted elimination attempt. She'd been in Viper's crosshairs without even knowing it. "Why?" she asked. "I've never met Viper, never interfered with his operation." "You've been volunteering at the Veterans Center on 4th Street, Parker said. It wasn't a question. "Running a support group for combat medics transitioning to civilian life." Morgan nodded. The weekly group was small but significant to her, a place where corpsmen, medics, and combat nurses could speak freely about the unique burdens they carried, the lives they'd saved, and lost, the responsibility that never quite left their shoulders. "That center is one of the Snake's recruitment hotspots," Parker continued. "According to Grant, you were flagged as a problem 6 months ago when you helped a former Army medic get into a private treatment program instead of the pain management the Snakes were offering." The memory clicked it into place. James Wilder, a former Army medic with 3 tours in Afghanistan and a back injury that had him on high-dose opioids. She'd recognized the signs of dependency and used her connections to get him into a specialized program for veterans with chronic pain and addiction issues. She hadn't known she was interfering with the River Snakes operation. She'd just been helping a fellow combat medic who was drowning. "So Grant's mission wasn't just about Blackwood," she said, the pieces aligning. "I was always a target. He just got efficient, going for both of us when he saw the opportunity." "Looks that way," Parker confirmed. "Viper seems to have a particular dislike for medical personnel who get between him and potential customers." The targeting felt personal in a way that transcended business interest. Morgan filed the information away for further consideration. Every predator had patterns, weaknesses, stemming from personal history or psychological blind spots. "What's our next move?" she asked deliberately, including herself in whatever plan was forming. Blackwood and Parker exchanged a glance that spoke volumes about their complicated relationship, mutual respect tempered by fundamental differences in approach. "Sheriff Parker has obtained warrants for the Snakes Clubhouse and 3 properties connected to their operation," Blackwood explained. "The raids are scheduled for tomorrow morning. In the meantime, we've identified a location where we believe Viper is storing his current shipment of fentanyl before distribution." "And you're going to—" "What?" Morgan asked. "Hit it tonight, destroy the product." "Reconnaissance only," Parker interjected firmly. "We need evidence that will stand up in court, not vigilante action that compromises the case." The tension between legal procedure and direct action was palpable. Morgan had seen similar conflicts in Afghanistan, military objectives hampered by rules of engagement, immediate tactical needs balanced against long-term strategic goals. "There's something else," Razor spoke up from his position against the wall. "Grant wasn't working alone. He had a spotter on Main Street, someone who confirmed Blackwood's location before he took the shot." "Do we know who?" Morgan asked. "Not yet," Blackwood replied, "but it means the Snakes have eyes in town, people we wouldn't necessarily recognize as connected to them." The implication was clear. Nowhere was truly safe, no one beyond suspicion. The Snakes' infiltration of the community ran deeper than visible members in cuts and colors. "I need to show you something," Blackwood said to Morgan, rising from his chair. "Doc, continue briefing the sheriff on what our source at the VA provided. Razor, you're with us." He led Morgan through the clubhouse to a back room that had been converted into a communications center. Multiple monitors displayed security camera feeds, maps of Oak Ridge, with locations marked in different colors, and what appeared to be a scheduling system for club members. Our intel operation, Blackwood explained, put up by a member who used to work signals intelligence for the Army. We monitor police bands, track snake movements, coordinate our own security. The sophistication of the setup surprised Morgan, though it shouldn't have. These men had applied their military training to civilian operations, creating systems that mirrored those they'd used in service. Blackwood sat at a keyboard, bringing up a series of photographs on the main screen. These were taken over the past 3 months at various veterans events in the county. I want you to look at each one carefully. Tell me if you recognize anyone besides the obvious snakes. Morgan studied the images, barbecues, fundraisers, support group meetings, all with River Snake members present in civilian clothes, some volunteering, others simply attending. Nothing overtly suspicious, just a slow infiltration of a vulnerable community. Then she saw him, a face that triggered immediate recognition, though it took her a moment to place it. That man, she said, pointing to a figure in the background of a VA hospital fundraiser. David Mercer. He works as a counselor at the Veterans Center, specializes in pain management and PTSD treatment. Blackwood and Razor exchanged a significant look. You're sure? Razor asked. Positive. He's facilitated sessions for my support group, has access to medical records, treatment histories, medication lists. The implications dawned on her as she spoke. He'd know exactly which veterans were on pain medication, which ones were struggling most with transition. Perfect position to identify targets, Blackwood observed grimly. Patients who trusted him, who shared their vulnerabilities, their challenges. And he's been there for years, Morgan added, the betrayal settling like a stone in her stomach, before the snakes even moved into Oak Ridge. Which suggests this isn't random expansion, Razor concluded. Viper chose this town specifically, had infrastructure in place before they ever showed colors here. The level of planning was disturbing, a long-term strategy rather than opportunistic criminal activity. Viper Miller was playing a deeper game than territorial expansion or market development. He targeted Oak Ridge with purpose, laying groundwork long before his club's colors appeared on local streets. There's more, Blackwood said, bringing up another set of images. These were taken 2 weeks ago at a storage facility on the edge of town. That's Mercer, again meeting with this man. The second figure was tall, well-dressed in business casual attire that stood in stark contrast to the typical River Snakes aesthetic. Nothing about him suggested connection to an outlaw motorcycle club, no visible tattoos, no leather hair, neatly trimmed in a conservative style. Who is he? Morgan asked. Charles Winters, Razor supplied. Regional Director for Veteran Care Pharmaceuticals. They manufacture generic opioids, including fentanyl, for legitimate medical use. The pieces aligned with disturbing clarity. They're diverting prescription medication, Morgan said. Getting legitimate pharmaceuticals through Winters, then distributing through networks Mercer identifies. More efficient than manufacturing or smuggling, Blackwood confirmed. Lower risk pharmaceutical grade product, steady supply chain. The operation was sophisticated, far beyond typical motorcycle club criminality. This wasn't street-level drug dealing. It was organized diversion of prescription medications by people with insider access to both supply and vulnerable populations. Does Parker know about this? Morgan asked. We showed him this morning, Blackwood replied. He's added the storage facility to tomorrow's warrants. But Viper's not stupid. He'll have moved anything incriminating by now. These photos are 2 weeks old. The frustration was evident in his voice, knowing the players but lacking the evidence to stop them watching as they poisoned a community he'd sworn to protect in his own way. What about Mercer? Morgan pressed. If we can prove his connection to Winters and the Snakes, that's conspiracy at minimum. Nothing concrete yet, Razor said. No direct evidence of him handling product or money, just meetings that could be explained away as professional consultation. The barriers of legal procedure versus moral certainty were familiar territory for Morgan. In combat, the rules of engagement sometimes protected the guilty while endangering the innocent. Civilian law enforcement operated under similar constraints, due process protecting rights, but sometimes impeding justice. So what's the play? She asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. Blackwood's expression hardened. Tonight we document, Get photographic evidence of Mercer Winters and any snakes at the storage facility. Build a case Parker can take to a judge for expanded warrants. It was the responsible approach to the lawful path. But Morgan sensed something beneath Blackwood's measured words, a contingency plan he wasn't voicing in her presence. And if that doesn't work, she pressed, if they cover their tracks too well or the evidence isn't strong enough, Blackwood met her gaze directly. Then we do what we've always done, protect our territory by whatever means necessary. The implicit threat wasn't directed at her, but Morgan felt its weight nonetheless. Blackwood was walking a fine line between cooperation with law enforcement and the more direct methods his club had employed in the past. His respect for Parker and perhaps his military background pushed him toward legal channels, but his responsibility to his community and his club left other options on the table. I want to help, Morgan said simply, not just with surveillance, with whatever comes next. Razor looked skeptical. Your shoulder is functional, she cut him off. And I know these people Mercer were the veterans they're targeting. I can identify connections you might miss, spot inconsistencies in their operation. Blackwood considered her for a long moment, that same searching look he'd given her before. This time, though, she understood it better. He was seeing her father in her features, measuring her against the Marine who'd saved his life decades earlier. Razor, give us a minute, he said finally. After Razor left, Blackwood leaned against the edge of the desk, arms crossed. I know who you are, Morgan, he said quietly. Not just a Navy corpsman who took a bullet for me. Robert Hayes' daughter. So he had recognized the connection. How long have you known? Since the hospital. Those Hayes eyes seen them before looking down a rifle barrel in Kuwait. Your father saved my life, took out a sniper I never saw coming. He paused. It seems the family talent for spotting hidden threats passed to the next generation. Morgan absorbed this confirmation. Why didn't you say anything? Wanted you to make your own choices, not feel obligated because of something that happened before you were old enough to remember. Blackwood's gaze was direct, unflinching. Your father's debt and mine, that's between us. Doesn't have to involve you. But it did involve her now, whether by chance or design. The bullet in her shoulder, the threat against her life, the veterans being targeted by the snakes, all of it connected her to this conflict more personally than any decades-old debt between warriors. I'm already involved, she said simply. Not because of my father or your history, because of what's happening now to people I care about. Blackwood nodded, accepting her reasoning without further challenge. Tonight, then, surveillance only documenting movements, gathering evidence Parker can use. No direct engagement unless absolutely necessary. Understood, Morgan agreed. What time? Midnight. Razor will pick you up at 11. As she turned to leave, Blackwood added, Morgan, your father. Have you told him about this connection about Kuwait? He told me this morning, she confirmed. Figured it at each when I mentioned you said I reminded you of someone. A shadow crossed Blackwood's weathered features. He was a good Marine, saved more than just my life that day. Then he paused. Tell him the debt hasn't been forgotten, even after all these years. Morgan nodded, understanding the weight of honor that men like Blackwood and her father carried, obligations that didn't diminish with time, promises kept across decades. Their world might seem antiquated in an age of moral relativism and situational ethics, but there was something reassuring in its constancy, a code that remained unbroken despite the changing world around it. As she left the clubhouse, Morgan felt the disparate pieces of her life aligning in unexpected ways. Her military service, her father's legacy, her work with veterans, and now her connection to the angels. Different threads woven together into a pattern she couldn't yet fully discern, but whose shape was beginning to emerge from the chaos of recent events. One thing was certain, the river snakes represented a threat beyond typical criminal activity. Their targeting of veterans, their sophisticated operation, and their willingness to eliminate anyone who interfered made them dangerous in ways that transcended territorial disputes between motorcycle clubs. They were predators exploiting the vulnerable, using the wounds of war to create profit from pain. And that Morgan couldn't abide, not as a corpsman, not as a veteran, and not as Robert Hayes' daughter. The night wrapped around Oak Ridge like a burial shroud, moonlight casting silver-blue shadows across empty streets and darkened buildings. Just past 11, the rumble of a motorcycle broke the silence on Sycamore Street as Razor pulled up to Morgan's house. She was waiting dressed in dark clothes, her injured shoulder still bandaged, but movement returning as healing progressed. The pain remained a constant companion she'd learned to accommodate rather than indulge. "Ready?" Razor asked as she approached. Morgan nodded, accepting the helmet he offered. No words were needed beyond that simple exchange. They both understood the mission parameters, surveillance-only documentation of the River Snake's operation building evidence Sheriff Parker could use to obtain more comprehensive warrants. The storage facility sat on the edge of town, a sprawling complex of metal buildings and chain-link fences illuminated by harsh security lights that created pools of white against the surrounding darkness. Razor parked the bike a quarter-mile away in the shadow of an abandoned gas station that offered clear sight lines to the facility's main entrance. "Blackwood and Wrench are already in position on the south side," he explained as they dismounted. "Doc's monitoring police bands from the clubhouse. If the snakes show, we document and transmit immediately." Morgan checked her equipment, the compact digital camera Blackwood had provided capable of high-resolution images in low light, and the small radio clipped to her belt. Professional gear for a professional operation, further evidence of the Angels' sophistication beyond their outlaw image. They moved on foot to their designated observation point, a small rise that offered concealment while providing clear view of the storage facility's north entrance. The night air carried the scent of creosote and dust, the desert exhaling accumulated heat from the day. Morgan settled into position, her body remembering the patient stillness of combat surveillance, despite the years since she'd last needed such skills. "You've done this before," Razor observed quietly, noting her practice movements. "Force Recon attach corpsmen to their units sometimes," she replied. "Medical support for long-range surveillance missions." She adjusted the camera settings without looking, muscle memory guiding her fingers. "You Army Rangers," he confirmed. 8 years, 3 deployments. Got out in 2012 after catching some shrapnel outside Kandahar. The shared military background created an immediate understanding between them. Unspoken protocols, common experiences, mutual respect for acquired skills. They fell into natural roles. Razor maintaining perimeter awareness while Morgan focused on documenting activity at the facility. For nearly an hour, nothing moved except security guards making their rounds, flashlights sweeping across empty pavement in predictable patterns. Then at 12:38 a.m., according to Morgan's watch, a dark SUV with tinted windows approached the main gate, headlights cutting through the darkness like surgeon's blades. "Movement," Morgan murmured into her radio. "Black Escalade, north entrance." Blackwood's voice came back immediately. "Copy. We've got a second vehicle approaching from the south. White panel van, no markings." The SUV stopped at the security gate where a guard emerged from the booth. A brief exchange, a flash of identification, and the gate swung open with mechanical precision. The van followed a minute later, both vehicles converging on a row of larger storage units near the center of the facility. "Camera up," Razor instructed, his voice low but urgent. Morgan raised the camera, zooming in on the figures emerging from both vehicles. From the SUV came 3 men, 2 wearing River Snake's colors, flanking a third in business casual attire she recognized as Charles Winters, the pharmaceutical executive. The van yielded 2 more individuals, one clearly, David Mercer, the VA counselor, and a heavy-set man whose bearing screamed authority despite his casual clothing. "That's Viper," Razor confirmed, following her gaze to the large man, Eric Miller himself. Morgan captured image after image as the group converged at one of the storage units. Mercer produced keys, unlocking the roll-up door with practiced efficiency. Inside, illuminated by the vehicle's headlights, she glimpsed stacked boxes bearing pharmaceutical logos, evidence of the diversion operation they'd suspected. "They're moving product," she whispered, the camera's shutter clicking rhythmically. "Looks like full distribution setup." Through the camera's zoom lens, Morgan observed the interaction between the men. The deference is shown to Viper, the businesslike exchange between Winters and Mercer, the efficient loading of boxes into the van. This wasn't a street corner drug deal. It was corporate in its precision, a well-oiled machine designed to move pharmaceutical-grade opioids from legitimate supply chains into the hands of vulnerable veterans. "Sending images now," Razor murmured, connecting Morgan's camera to a small device that transmitted the photos directly to the Angels' communications center. As the group finished loading the van, Viper stepped aside with Winters, their conversation animated though too distant to overhear. The pharmaceutical executive appeared defensive, hands raised in placating gestures, while Viper's body language grew increasingly aggressive. "Trouble in paradise," Morgan observed, capturing the exchange in a series of rapid shots. Suddenly, Viper's hand shot out, grabbing Winters by the throat and shoving him against the storage unit door. The violence was swift, practiced the movement of a man accustomed to physical intimidation. Morgan's finger pressed the shutter continuously, documenting evidence of assault to add to the drug charges. "Blackwood's going to want to move," Razor said tensely. "This is exactly what Parker needs, clear evidence of Viper assaulting Winters while surrounded by diverted pharmaceuticals." Morgan kept the camera trained on the scene, watching as Mercer intervened, placing a hand on Viper's arm in a calming gesture. The River Snake's president released Winters, who slumped against the metal door, hand at his throat, face contorted in fear and anger. "We need to transmit all of this," she agreed, "but there's something else happening." The dynamic had shifted subtly. Mercer now stood slightly apart from the group, checking his phone with increasing agitation. He showed the screen to Viper, whose reaction was immediate and explosive. The Snake leader rounded on Winters, gesturing wildly, his posture radiating rage. "Something's wrong," Razor murmured. "They know." Morgan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "We've been compromised." As if confirming her assessment, the group below suddenly dispersed, moving with urgent purpose. Viper grabbed Winters by the collar, dragging him toward the SUV, while barking orders to his men. Mercer rushed to secure the storage unit, slamming the roll-up door and padlocking it with frantic haste. "All units pull back," Blackwood's voice came through the radio. "Operation compromised. Rendezvous at fallback position Alpha." Morgan and Razor began their withdrawal, moving with the quiet efficiency of trained operators. They'd nearly reached their motorcycle when headlights swept across the abandoned gas station, illuminating their position with brutal clarity. "Down," Razor hissed, pulling Morgan behind a crumbling concrete barrier as a vehicle accelerated toward them, engine roaring in the night silence. The SUV skidded to a stop 30 yards away, doors flying open as dark figures emerged, the metallic click of weapons being readied, carrying clearly through the still air. Morgan recognized Viper among them, his massive frame unmistakable, even in the poor light. "We know you're there," Viper's voice boomed across the distance. "Come out now and maybe you walk away from this." Razor drew a handgun from beneath his cut, checking the magazine with practiced movements. "Back door," he whispered to Morgan, "through the station into the wash behind. I'll cover." Morgan shook her head. "Together," she insisted. "They'll flank the building as soon as we move." The standoff stretched for several heartbeats, options diminishing with each passing second. Then, breaking the tension, came the distinctive rumble of approaching motorcycles, multiple engines growing louder, headlights appearing on the access road beyond the gas station. "Cavalry's here," Razor murmured, relief evident in his voice. 4 bikes roared into view, led by Blackwood's Road King, the riders moving in tight formation. They circled the SUV, creating a barrier between Viper's men and Morgan's position, engines growling like predators establishing territory. Blackwood dismounted, facing Viper across 20 yards of cracked pavement. Neither man reached for a weapon, though the air between them crackled with potential violence. "This is private property, Miller," Blackwood called, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "You're trespassing." Viper's laugh held no humor. "Funny coming from you, James. Spying on my business, taking pictures of a private transaction. That sounds like criminal behavior to me." "No laws against photographing criminal activity," Blackwood countered. "Those pills you're moving, they don't belong to you. They belong in pharmacies prescribed to patients who need them." "Free market economy," Viper shot back. "Supply and demand. I'm just an entrepreneur meeting a need." "By killing veterans with fentanyl," the disgust in Blackwood's voice was palpable. "By targeting men and women who served their country, who came home broken, looking for help." Morgan watched the exchange from cover, struck by the fundamental difference between these two men. Both were leaders of outlaw organizations, both operated outside conventional law, but the moral gulf between them yawned wide and unbridgeable. Blackwood's code, however unorthodox, included boundaries, principles, lines he wouldn't cross. Viper recognized no such limits. "Business is business," Viper replied with a dismissive shrug. "Not my fault if some can't handle their medicine." The callous response sent a surge of cold fury through Morgan's veins. 26 deaths in the county this year alone, sons and daughters, husbands and wives. Veterans who'd survived war only to fall victim to predators like Viper Miller on the home front they'd fought to protect. Her hand tightened on the camera, the evidence it contained suddenly feeling inadequate compared to the enormity of Viper's crimes. Legal process seemed too slow, too uncertain, when measured against the lives already lost and those still at risk. As though reading her thoughts, Blackwood's voice cut through the night air with steel resolve. It ends tonight, Miller. We've got everything you Winters, Mercer, the drugs, all documented. Sheriff Parker's getting it all in real time. Viper's composure cracked slightly, his gaze shifting to the darkness around them as though expecting law enforcement to materialize at any moment. You're working with cops now, Blackwood. How the mighty have fallen. I'm working with whoever it takes to keep poison off my streets, Blackwood retorted, to keep you from killing more veterans who survive wars just to die in alleys from your product. The tension ratcheted higher, Viper's men shifting restlessly, hands hovering near concealed weapons. Morgan sensed the moment balancing on a knife edge. One wrong move, one hot-headed action, and the night would erupt in violence that wouldn't end with those currently present. Then cutting through the standoff like a scalpel came the distant wail of police sirens, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. That's your cue to disappear, Miller, Blackwood said evenly. Unless you want to explain to Sheriff Parker what you're doing here with a pharmaceutical executive at midnight. Viper's face contorted with rage and calculation. The sirens grew closer, decision time compressing to seconds rather than minutes. With a curt gesture to his men, he backed toward the SUV. This isn't over, Blackwood, he snarled. Not by a long shot. For once we agree, Blackwood replied, his voice low and certain. This is just beginning. The SUV's engine roared to life, tires spinning on loose gravel as it executed a hasty three-point turn and accelerated away from the abandoned gas station. As it disappeared into the darkness, Blackwood signaled to Morgan and Razor. Time to move, he called. Parker's coming in hot, and we need to be elsewhere when he arrives. They emerged from cover, Morgan still clutching the camera with its precious evidence. Razor's bike stood where they'd left it, untouched in the chaos of the confrontation. You got what we needed? Blackwood asked as they approached. Morgan nodded, handing him the camera. Everything. Viper Winters, Mercer the drugs, plus assault when Viper attacked Winters. Should be enough for Parker to get warrants for all of them. Good work. Blackwood's approval was genuine, but distracted, his focus already shifting to their extraction. Razor, take Morgan back to the clubhouse. We'll regroup there, debrief before Parker comes looking for us. As they prepared to leave, Morgan glanced back at the storage facility, now illuminated by approaching police lights. The pieces of the operation were falling into place. Evidence secured, law enforcement engaged, the River Snakes operation exposed. Yet something felt unfinished, a loose thread pulling at the edges of her awareness. Viper gave up too easily, she said suddenly, the realization crystallizing. He had numbers on his side before we showed up, had the drop on us. Why back off so quickly when the sirens started? Blackwood's expression darkened. Because he knew Parker was coming. Which means he has someone inside the department, Morgan finished. Someone who warned him about the surveillance, about Parker's involvement. The implications were chilling, the River Snakes' influence extending beyond their visible membership into law enforcement itself. No wonder they'd operated with such impunity, expanding their territory without significant interference. We need to move now, Blackwood ordered, his tone brooking no argument. If Viper's got cops on his payroll, this just got a lot more complicated. As Morgan climbed onto Razor's bike, the night's events rearranged themselves in her mind, forming new patterns of connection and causality. What had seemed a straightforward drug operation now revealed layers of corruption and infiltration that threatened the foundations of Oak Ridge itself. The stakes had risen dramatically, transforming a territorial dispute between motorcycle clubs into something that challenged the very institutions meant to protect the community. The road ahead stretched dark and uncertain, but one thing was clear. There would be no walking away, no return to the quiet isolation of her previous existence. Morgan Hayes was committed now to seeing this through, to protecting the veterans being targeted, to honoring the code she shared with men like her father and James Blackwood. A code that demanded action when innocents were threatened, regardless of personal cost or conventional boundaries. As they accelerated into the night, leaving the scene behind, Morgan felt the weight of that commitment settling onto her shoulders, familiar and almost welcome after the purposeless drift of her civilian days. She had found her mission again, her tribe, her place in a conflict that mattered. And this time she wouldn't be fighting alone. Dawn broke over the Angels' clubhouse in shades of amber and gold, painting the weathered brick in warm light that belied the tension within. Morgan sat at the long wooden table, a cup of coffee cooling before her, listening as Blackwood debriefed the night's events with his inner circle. The evidence they'd gathered, photographs of Viper Winters and Mercer with the diverted pharmaceuticals, had been transmitted to Sheriff Parker before their confrontation at the gas station. Now they awaited his response, uncertain how deeply the River Snake's corruption had penetrated the department. Parker's solid Blackwood is saying certainty in his voice, despite the circumstances. Whatever's happening in his department, he's not part of it. Doesn't change the fact that someone tipped Viper, Wrench countered. They knew we were watching, knew Parker was involved. Could be anyone, Doc suggested. Dispatch your deputy support staff. Doesn't have to be a badge. In the discussion continued, mapping possible leaks, vulnerabilities in their operation, contingencies for what might come next. Morgan listened with the focused attention of a combat veteran, assessing threats and options with clinical detachment despite her personal involvement. Her phone vibrated on the table, a text from her father. Need to talk, important, my place. She excused herself, stepping outside to call him directly. Robert Hayes answered on the first ring, his voice tight with urgency. Don't talk, just listen, he said without preamble. Parker's at my house. Needs to meet with you in Blackwood, off the record. His department's compromised. Understood, Morgan replied. We'll be there in 20. She returned to the clubhouse, pulling Blackwood aside to relay the message. His expression hardened as he absorbed the implications. Parker wouldn't come to your father's house without good reason, he observed. This is worse than we thought. When they departed immediately, Blackwood on his Road King Morgan, riding behind Razor, the rest of the Angels, maintaining position at the clubhouse in case of reprisal from the Snakes. The morning streets were beginning to stir with early commuters, the ordinary rhythms of Oak Ridge continuing, despite the shadow war being waged beneath its surface. Robert Hayes's modest ranch house sat on a quiet street lined with mature cottonwoods, their leaves whispering in the morning breeze. A nondescript sedan was parked in the driveway, Parker's unmarked unit positioned to be visible from the road, but unidentifiable as law enforcement to casual observation. Morgan's father met them at the door, his weathered face set in the stoic expression she'd known all her life. He nodded to Blackwood with the respect of one warrior, acknowledging another personal history momentarily set aside in service of present crisis. Sheriff's in the kitchen, he said, simply leading them through the neat, sparsely furnished house that reflected his military precision and solitary lifestyle. Raymond Parker sat at the kitchen table, still in uniform, but looking distinctly unofficial. His hat placed beside him, shirt collar, unbuttoned, the weight of his office temporarily shed in this private meeting. He rose as they entered, extending his hand first to Morgan, then to Blackwood. Appreciate you coming, he said, the formality of his tone at odds with the urgency in his eyes. What I'm about to share doesn't leave this room. Official channels are compromised. They settled around the table, Robert Hayes taking position by the window, where he could observe the street old habits reasserting themselves in times of tension. The evidence you transmitted last night, Parker began without preamble. It disappeared from our secure server within an hour of receipt. Backup files corrupted, physical copies missing from the evidence room. Blackwood's expression darkened. Inside job. Has to be, Parker confirmed grimly. Someone with admin access to our systems and physical access to secure areas. Narrows the field, but not enough to point fingers without proof. What about the warrants, Morgan asked. For the Snakes clubhouse, the storage facility. Judge Monroe signed them based on my verbal briefing, Parker replied. But when the paperwork was processed, the addresses were wrong, led our teams to empty buildings on the wrong side of town. His jaw tightened with suppressed fury. By the time we realized the error, the Snakes had cleared everything out. Storage unit, empty, clubhouse, scrubbed clean. The level of infiltration was staggering, not just a single corrupt officer, but systematic compromise of department operations, evidence handling, and legal processes. The River Snake's reach extended far deeper into Oak Ridge's institutions than any of them had suspected. Viper's been planning this for years, Blackwood said, voicing the conclusion they had all reached, placing people in positions of influence, building his infrastructure before ever showing colors here. The question is why, Morgan interjected. Why Oak Ridge specifically, where not a major distribution hub, not strategically located for drug trafficking? There are easier targets with less established competition. Parker and Robert exchanged a glance that carried unspoken significance. There's something you both need to see, Robert said, rising from his position by the window. He left the room, briefly returning with a worn manila folder that he placed carefully on the table. This may explain Viper's fixation on Oak Ridge. Inside were military records, deployment orders, after-action reports, personnel files dating back to the early 1990s. Gulf War era, Morgan noted, recognizing the formatting from historical documents she'd encountered during her service. Operation Desert Shield 1990, Robert began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a briefing officer. Before the main invasion to liberate Kuwait, special operations teams were inserted to gather intelligence, designate targets, prepare the battlefield. He extracted a black and white photograph showing a group of soldiers in desert camouflage, faces young, but eyes already carrying the weight of combat experience. Morgan recognized her father immediately, standing tall and alert, despite the exhaustion evident in his posture. First recon attachment to Army Rangers, Robert continued. Joint operation to identify chemical weapons facilities near the Kuwait border. High-risk deep insertion, minimal support. Blackwood leaned forward, recognition dawning as he studied the photograph. I remember this mission, he said quietly. We lost 3 men. Ambush at the extraction point. Robert nodded, a shadow crossing his features. Intelligence failure. Someone compromised the mission, gave our position to Iraqi forces. We were pinned down, taking fire from 3 sides when your team arrived to extract us. Parker, who had remained silent during this exchange, now spoke. What does a 30-year-old mission in Kuwait have to do with Viper, Miller, and Oak Ridge? Robert extracted another photograph from the folder, a military ID image of a much younger, clean-cut man whose features nonetheless carried the unmistakable stamp of the River Snake's president. Staff Sergeant Eric Miller, he said. Army intelligence attached to our operation as liaison with Central Command, responsible for coordinating our extraction, maintaining secure communications. Understanding dawned on Morgan's face. He was the leak, she said, the pieces aligning with terrible clarity. He sold out the mission. We could never prove it, Robert confirmed grimly. But the evidence was there for those who knew where to look. Inconsistencies in his reports, convenient equipment, failures, the precision of the enemy's response to our movements. Miller was selling information to the Iraqis, Parker asked, disbelief coloring his tone. To whoever would pay, Blackwood corrected, the memories visibly resurfacing as he spoke. There were rumors, black market dealings, stolen equipment, intelligence, sold to private contractors. Nothing concrete enough for charges, but the smoke was there. Robert nodded. After the war, investigations were started, then quietly discontinued. Politics, oil interests, diplomatic considerations, the usual reasons for burying uncomfortable truths. And Miller walked away clean. Morgan concluded, the full picture emerging with sickening clarity. Honorable discharge decorations, his record intact. Not entirely clean, Blackwood countered, his voice hardening. Some of us knew, kept track of him over the years. He bounced between private military contractors, security firms, always one step ahead of his reputation, until he disappeared off the grid entirely about 10 years ago. And reappeared as Viper, Parker said, completing the connection. President of an outlaw motorcycle club, dealing drugs instead of intelligence. Robert turned to the last page in the folder, a list of names with locations noted beside them. These are the surviving members of that Kuwait operation, both recon and Rangers. 15 men total. His finger traced down the list, stopping at a particular entry. 12 of them have settled in Oak Ridge County over the past 20 years, including myself and Blackwood. The implication was unmistakable, not coincidence, but calculation. Viper hadn't chosen Oak Ridge randomly for his operation. He'd selected it specifically because it contained witnesses to his past betrayal, men who might recognize him despite the years and physical changes, men who carried knowledge that could destroy the new identity he'd built. He came here to bury his past. Morgan said, the realization settling like cold stone in her stomach. By burying the men who knew it. And using veterans as his primary targets for drug distribution, Blackwood added, disgust evident in his tone. Killing the very people he once served alongside. Poetic justice in his twisted mind. Parker leaned back in his chair, absorbing the connections between a 30-year-old betrayal in the desert and the current crisis in his jurisdiction. This changes things, he said finally. This isn't just about drugs anymore. It's personal for Miller Viper. He won't back down, won't be reasoned with. He never intended to coexist with the Angels, Morgan observed. The territorial disputes, the escalating provocations, they were just pretexts. His real target was always the veterans who settled here, especially those who served with him in Kuwait. The weight of this revelation settled over the room, the understanding that they faced not just a criminal organization, but a man systematically erasing his past through the elimination of those who remembered it. The shooting on Main Street took on new significance, not random violence or territorial posturing, but a calculated attempt to remove Blackwood, one of the few who could connect Eric Miller to Viper. What's our next move? Blackwood asked, his question directed primarily at Parker, but including them all by extension. The sheriff considered for a long moment, the oath of his office balanced against the corruption within his department. Officially, my hands are tied, he said finally. Without evidence that will stand up in court, without knowing who in my department is compromised, I can't move against Viper directly. And unofficially, Robert prompted, the question hanging in the air between them. Parker met his gaze steadily. Unofficially, I need time to clean house, to identify the leak, secure evidence that can't be compromised, build a case that will stick regardless of interference. Time we don't have, Blackwood pointed out. Viper knows we're on to him now. He'll accelerate his plans, eliminate loose ends, including everyone in this room. The stark assessment wasn't fear-mongering, but tactical reality. Viper Miller had spent years building his operation, infiltrating institutions, establishing his power base. With his cover potentially compromised, he would move decisively to protect himself, regardless of collateral damage. There's another option, Morgan said quietly, all eyes turning to her. We take the fight to him. Not through official channels, not through the Angels as a club, but as veterans defending our own. The men on that list, the survivors from Kuwait, they deserve to know what's happening. They deserve the chance to protect themselves. The proposal hung in the air, neither endorsed nor rejected by the others present. It occupied the gray area between lawful action and vigilante justice, a space all too familiar to veterans who'd operated in combat zones where legal niceties often surrendered to survival necessities. That's dangerous territory, Morgan, Parker warned. Outside the law, beyond my ability to protect any of you if things go sideways. With respect, Sheriff, she replied evenly. We're already in dangerous territory. Viper's targeting veterans with drugs designed to kill them slowly, and now we know why, to silence potential witnesses to his past crimes. How many more will die while we navigate bureaucracy and search for leaks in your department? Her challenge wasn't directed at Parker personally, but at the constraints of his office limitations she understood, but could no longer accept given the stakes involved. Robert spoke next, his voice carrying the weight of command despite the decades since he'd worn a uniform. The men on this list, they're my responsibility. My brothers. I won't stand by while Miller picks them off one by one. Blackwood nodded in silent agreement, his expression reflecting the same commitment to those who had served alongside him, regardless of the years that had passed since. Parker looked between them, measuring their resolve against his oath of office. I can't sanction this, he said finally. Can't be part of planning or executing whatever you're considering. We're not asking for sanction, Morgan assured him. Just time. Keep your investigation internal, focus on cleaning your department. Let us handle Viper and his operation. The unspoken arrangement crystallized between them. Parker would maintain official distance, pursue the corruption within his department through proper channels, while Morgan, Blackwood, and Robert gathered the surviving veterans to confront the threat Viper posed directly. 48 hours, Parker conceded after a long moment. That's how long to delay any official action against the river snakes without raising flags. After that, I have to move regardless of internal concerns. It wasn't much time, but it would have to be enough. The four of them rose from the table, the alliance formed in that kitchen, transcending their different paths, law enforcement, military service, outlaw motorcycle club, united by a common enemy and a shared code that placed protection of the vulnerable above personal safety or legal technicalities. As they prepared to leave, Parker paused, turning to Blackwood with an expression that balanced professional duty against personal respect. "For the record," he said quietly, "I still think your club operates too far outside the law for comfort." Blackwood's mouth quirked in acknowledgement. "For the record, I still think your badge sometimes blinds you to necessary action." Parker nodded, accepting the fundamental difference in their approaches. "But we both want the same thing for this town." "On that," Blackwood agreed, "we've always been aligned at Tomed." The moment passed between them, not friendship exactly, but mutual recognition of shared purpose, despite differing methods. It was enough to bridge the gap, for now, to create the working alliance necessary to confront the threat Viper Miller represented to Oak Ridge and its citizens. Outside, as they prepared to depart, Morgan found herself standing beside her father, both of them watching as Parker and Blackwood conferred briefly by their vehicles. "You always said there were no coincidences in combat," she observed, echoing a lesson he'd taught her years ago. That patterns meant purpose, connections meant causality. Robert nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where mountains rose against the morning sky. "Miller's been planning in this for years," he said quietly, "tracking us down, establishing his operation here, preparing to eliminate witnesses to his betrayal in Kuwait." "But he didn't count on us recognizing the pattern," Morgan replied, "on us connecting his past to his present actions." "No," her father agreed, a hint of grim satisfaction in his tone. "He didn't count on the Hayes family tendency to see what others miss. Just like you saw that gun on Main Street before it fired." The parallel between their actions, Robert spotting a sniper in Kuwait before he could fire on Blackwood, Morgan seeing the threat to Blackwood on Main Street 30 years later, stood as testament to the legacy that bound them. Not just shared blood or physical traits, but a fundamental approach to the world, an instinctive protection of others, regardless of personal cost. As they prepared to mount up, Blackwood and Morgan on their motorcycles, Parker in his unmarked unit, Robert in his aging pickup, Morgan felt the separate threads of her life weaving together into a coherent whole. Her military service, her father's legacy, her connection to Blackwood, her work with veterans, all of it converging on this moment, this mission to protect those who had served from a predator wearing the false face of brotherhood. The road ahead held danger, uncertainty, and difficult choices. But for the first time since leaving the Navy, Morgan Hayes felt the clear purpose that had been missing from her civilian existence. She was a corpsman again, in a sense, not on a battlefield of sand and stone, but on the streets of Oak Ridge, where veterans fought a different kind of war against enemies they couldn't always see. And just as she had in Afghanistan and Iraq, she would stand with them, heal what wounds she could, and face whatever came next with the steady courage that had carried her through firefights and field surgeries in distant lands. This was her mission now. These were her people. And Viper Miller would learn what happened when he targeted those under her protection. The veterans gathered at Robert Hayes's ranch just before dawn, 15 men who had once served together in the deserts of Kuwait, now united again by a common enemy. They arrived in pickup trucks and sedans, on motorcycles and in jeeps, older. Now many with silver in their hair and lines carved into their faces, but still carrying themselves with military bearing. Men who had seen war and returned home to build lives only to discover that a specter from their past had followed them. Morgan stood on the porch watching them assemble in her father's driveway. The Hells Angels had come too. Blackwood's inner circle, only men he trusted completely. Razor Wrench Doc and 4 others, their leather cuts somber against the pale morning light. This wasn't club business anymore. It was personal, a matter of honor that transcended patches and colors. Inside, Robert Hayes had transformed his living room into a tactical operations center. Maps of Oak Ridge covered the walls, satellite images of Viper's compound printed from a home computer, notes on river snakes' movements and habits gathered over months of observation. The planning had continued through the night, veterans falling back into the rhythm of mission preparation with practiced ease despite the decades since they'd last worked together. "Sheriff Parker called," Blackwood said, joining Morgan on the porch. "He's identified the leak. Deputy Chief's been on Viper's payroll for 2 years. Taking him in now." Morgan nodded, absorbing the information. "That means Viper will know soon, if he doesn't already." "Exactly. Whatever we're going to do, it has to be today." Blackwood's eyes scanned the horizon as though he could see the conflict coming. "Parker's bought us 12 hours at most before he has to move officially." The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. Robert and his fellow veterans would evacuate the remaining men on Viper's list, those who might not be capable of defending themselves, while Blackwood and his angels created a diversion at the River Snake's main hangout. Meanwhile, Morgan would lead a small team to Viper's personal compound, where, according to intelligence gathered by Parker's trusted deputies, the evidence linking Eric Miller to his past crimes was stored. "You sure about this?" Blackwood asked, his voice low. "Going after Viper directly?" "I'm sure," Morgan replied, checking her sidearm with practiced movements. "He won't expect it. Too focused on you and my father." Her shoulder still ached, but the wound was healing well. More importantly, her mind was clear-focused in a way it hadn't been since leaving the service. Purpose had returned to her life, not in the way she'd expected, but purpose nonetheless. "Time to move," Robert called from inside, and the assembled veterans and bikers moved with synchronized precision, breaking into teams, checking communications weapons, sliding into concealed holsters. None of them wanted bloodshed, but all were prepared for it if necessary. Morgan's team consisted of herself, Razor, and two veterans from her father's unit, men who had known Eric Miller before he became Viper, who could identify him regardless of how much he'd changed his appearance. They departed in an unmarked van, heading for the isolated property Viper had purchased under a shell company's name 3 years earlier. The compound sat nestled against the foothills, a sprawling ranch house with outbuildings that could have belonged to any wealthy retiree. Only the security measures betrayed its true nature: cameras disguised as landscape lighting motion sensors, hidden in decorative rocks, a gate that appeared ornamental but could stop a truck. Morgan's team approached on foot, using the terrain for cover. Her military training returned fully now, muscle memory guiding her movements as they maneuvered through the scrub. They bypassed the electronic security by cutting power to the perimeter systems, a vulnerability identified by one of the veterans who had installed similar setups for high-end clients. The house appeared empty, but they moved with caution nonetheless. Inside, the opulent furnishings spoke of wealth acquired through means other than motorcycle club activities. Crystal decanters filled with amber liquid, original artwork on walls, custom furniture imported from overseas, the lifestyle of a man who had profited from the misery of others for decades. "Office should be through there," Razor whispered, indicating a hallway leading deeper into the house. Morgan nodded, taking point with her sidearm ready. The corridor ended at a heavy wooden door, locked but yielding to the electronic bypass one of the veterans had brought. Inside was a study straight from a corporate executive's dream. Leather-bound books, mahogany desk, computer equipment, worth more than Morgan's entire house. "Look for a safe," she instructed. Miller wouldn't keep anything important on computers that could be seized. They searched methodically, professionally, disturbing nothing more than necessary. It was Razor who found it, a floor safe hidden beneath an antique Persian rug, its combination lock gleaming in the filtered light through heavy drapes. "Can you open it?" Morgan asked the veteran who had once been EOD. The man nodded, removing tools from his pack with steady hands. "Give me 5 minutes." 4 minutes later, the safe door swung open. Inside lay the evidence they sought: military files stolen from government archives, financial records dating back to the Gulf War, showing payments to consultant EM from Iraqi front companies, photographs documenting Miller's transformation into Viper, and most damning, a journal in his own handwriting detailing his betrayal and subsequent evasion of justice. "This is it," Morgan said carefully, placing the documents in a waterproof bag. "Everything Parker needs to finish him." They were preparing to leave when the sound of vehicles approaching shattered the silence, multiple engines moving fast. "Company," Razor said, moving to the window. "Looks like Viper got tipped off again." Morgan made a quick assessment. "Take the evidence. Get it to Parker. We'll cover your exit." "Not leaving you behind," Razor protested. "Not a request," Morgan replied, the command in her voice unmistakable. "The evidence is what matters. Go. Now." Razor hesitated, then nodded, taking the package and slipping out through a side entrance. Morgan and the two veterans took defensive positions, weapons ready, but hoping to avoid the confrontation that now seemed inevitable. The front door burst open moments later, Viper himself leading a group of river snakes into the house. He was larger than Morgan had expected, with none of the military bearing that still marked Blackwood despite the years. Power had made him soft physically, but his eyes were sharp, cold, calculating. "I know you're in here," he called, his voice echoing through the house. "Hayes' daughter, right? The one who took a bullet for Blackwood should have aimed for you first. Morgan remained silent, watching through a crack in the partially open study door as the snakes spread out through the house, searching room by room. Your father's been a problem for 30 years, Viper continued, clearly trying to provoke a response. Should have taken care of him in Kuwait. Would have saved me a lot of trouble. The footsteps grew closer. Morgan signaled to the veterans, preparing for the moment that could no longer be avoided. When Viper himself pushed open the study door, she was waiting, weapon leveled at his chest. Eric Miller, she said calmly, or do you prefer traitor? Viper's face contorted with rage and something else, fear perhaps, at hearing his real name spoken aloud. You have no idea what you're dealing with, girl. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Morgan replied. A man who sold out his brothers in arms for money, who spent 30 years trying to bury his past by burying the witnesses. The standoff stretched, tension crackling between them. Viper's men had found the other veterans creating similar tableaus throughout the house, a frozen moment between violence and resolution. You think this ends here, Viper sneered. I've got judges, politicians, half the county in my pocket. You've got nothing. We have everything, Morgan countered. Your files from the safe, your journal, the financial records, all of it's heading to Sheriff Parker right now. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Viper's face. His gaze darted to the empty safe, then back to Morgan. It's over, Miller, she said quietly. The question is whether you walk out of here in cuffs or a body bag. Your choice. What happened next occurred with the fluid rapidity of combat, Viper reaching for his weapon, Morgan reacting with trained precision, the sound of a single shot echoing through the room. Viper staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, the mirror image of Morgan's own wound from days earlier. Poetic, she observed as he collapsed into a chair, blood seeping between his fingers. Now you know how it feels. The fight seemed to drain out of him, and with it, the will of his men. Within minutes, the situation stabilized. The river snakes disarmed Viper, secured no casualties on either side. Morgan's phone buzzed with a text from Razor. Package delivered, Parker moving now. It was over, not with the thunderous climax of a Hollywood film, but with the quiet competence of professionals who understood that real victories were measured in lives saved rather than blood spilled. 6 months later, Morgan Hayes stood in the bright Arizona sunshine, watching as veterans and their families gathered for the grand opening of the Oak Ridge Veterans Support Center. The building had once been the River Snakes clubhouse, seized in the aftermath of Viper's arrest and repurposed through a community initiative led by Sheriff Parker and, surprisingly, the Hells Angels. Quite a turnout, Blackwood observed, joining her on the sidelines. His Road King gleamed in the parking lot among dozens of other motorcycles angels who had come to support the event, many of them veterans themselves. Better than I expected, Morgan agreed. The months since Viper's downfall had been busy ones. His organization had collapsed without his leadership, many members turning state's evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. The corruption he'd fostered had been exposed and excised, though the healing process for the community would take longer. Eric Viper Miller himself now resided in a federal prison, facing charges that ranged from treason to drug trafficking to conspiracy to commit murder. The evidence Morgan and her team had recovered from his safe had been damning, opening investigations that stretched back decades and across multiple states. Your father giving the speech, Blackwood asked, nodding toward the podium set up near the entrance. Along with Parker, Morgan replied. The unlikely alliance between her father, the sheriff, and the Hells Angels had evolved into something approaching friendship, different men from different worlds united by a common code that transcended their divergent paths. The center itself would provide services. Morgan had advocated for years addiction and recovery programs, specifically designed for veterans, mental health support, job training, and perhaps most importantly, community. A place where those who had served could find understanding among others who had walked similar paths. Heard you're taking a position here, Blackwood said as they watched the crowd continue to grow. Morgan nodded. Medical director, starting next month. After years of drifting, she had found her purpose again, healing the wounds that weren't visible, supporting those who had sacrificed for their country, only to struggle in the peace they'd helped secure. The leather workshop remained a hobby, but her medical training would once again be her vocation. As her father stepped to the podium and the crowd fell silent, Morgan felt a sense of completion she hadn't experienced since leaving the Navy. The bullet meant for Blackwood had changed her life's trajectory in ways she couldn't have imagined that Saturday afternoon on Main Street. What had begun as instinctive reaction had become deliberate choice, returning her to the service that had always defined her. In military tradition, Robert Hayes began his voice carrying across the gathered veterans and citizens. We honor not just those who fell, but those who stood, who continue to stand for their brothers and sisters in arms. Morgan caught her father's eye, and in that moment of connection, she understood that some debts could never truly be repaid. They could only be passed forward, extending the chain of honor and obligation that bound one generation of warriors to the next. And in Oak Ridge, Arizona, that chain remained unbroken.